There is a particular sound that a wooden lock gate makes when it begins to swing open just before dawn. A long, slow groan of oak against oak, the creak travelling out across the still water and bouncing off the stone walls of the lock chamber, and underneath it the soft rush of water beginning to find its new level. In a small canal town in upstate New York, in 1843, in the half-light before the sky has begun to colour, this is the first sound of the day. Before the roosters, before the chimneys begin to smoke, before the boatman on the deck of a packet tied up at the warehouse wharf rolls onto his side and reaches for his boots. The lock gate moves and the water begins to drop, and the day, by some unspoken agreement among everyone who lives within earshot, has begun. If you enjoy listening to sleep stories like this, subscribe. I post stories like this weekly. Let me tell you what kind of town we're in tonight. It is small. Almost everyone you will meet here is within a quarter-mile of the canal. The canal is the reason the town exists. Without the canal, there is no town. There is only farmland and forest and a creek that does not go anywhere particular. With the canal, there is a main street and a livery stable and a feed store and 3 taverns and a Methodist church and a schoolhouse and a blacksmith and a cooper who makes barrels for the wheat that comes in from the farms west of here on its way to Albany, and from there down the Hudson to New York. The canal has made all of this possible. The canal is the spine of the town. Everything else is ribs. The canal itself is 40 feet wide at the surface and 4 feet deep. That is worth sitting with for a moment, because most people picture canals as being significantly larger than they actually were. 4 feet deep. You could wade across it if you had to, and people sometimes did, when a boat had thrown a load and a barrel had drifted into the shallows on the far side. 40 feet wide. 2 boats could pass each other if both were careful, and there were detailed rules about which boat had right of way, and those rules were broken regularly. And arguments about right of way were one of the more reliable ways for boatmen to find themselves trading punches outside a tavern in the evening. The towpath runs along one side of the canal, 10 feet wide packed dirt, worn smooth by decades of mules and horses and the boys who walked behind them. The opposite bank is called the heel path, and there is no path on that side worth speaking of. Just brush and the occasional stand of trees. The towpath is where the work happens. The mules walk along the towpath. The boys walk behind the mules. The line runs from the harness of the mules across the surface of the water to the bow of the boat, and the boat moves at a steady 3 miles an hour, sometimes a little faster going east, sometimes a little slower going west, depending on the current and the load and how recently the mules have been changed out. 3 miles an hour. That is the speed at which goods and people moved across this country in the 1840s. A boat leaving Buffalo on a Tuesday morning, bound for Albany, would arrive on the following Tuesday afternoon. 6 days. 363 miles. We tend to think of this as slow, and by the standards of any modern transportation it certainly is. But it was not slow at the time. It was the fastest that bulk freight had ever moved overland in the history of human commerce up to that point. Before the canal, the same load of wheat would have taken 3 weeks to travel from Buffalo to Albany by wagon, and the wagon would have damaged the load, and the wagon would have cost roughly 10 times as much per mile as the canal boat. The Erie Canal, which opened in 1825, did not just change shipping costs. It changed what shipping costs meant. It changed what was possible to ship at all. You can stand on the bank of this canal in 1843 and watch the boats go by, and you are watching, in a quite literal sense, the economic backbone of the United States. Wheat from the Genesee Valley, salt from Syracuse, lumber from the Adirondacks, coal from the Pennsylvania mines coming up the connecting branches, manufactured goods from New England heading west, people heading west also, whole families with everything they owned tied up in canvas, sleeping on the deck of a line boat at 3 cents per mile, going to start over somewhere in Ohio or Michigan or further. The canal carried all of this. The canal carried, in the peak years, more freight than any railroad in the country. The canal carried, for a period of about 40 years, the actual physical substance of American economic life. And the town we are in tonight existed because someone, somewhere, had decided that this stretch of canal needed a stopping place, a place where boats could tie up overnight, a place where mules could be changed, a place where boatmen could buy a meal and a drink, and if they had the money, a bed, a place where the cargo could be transferred when there was transferring to do, a place where the locks needed tending, and where the lock tender's family needed a roof over their heads. The town has perhaps 800 people living in it, maybe 1,000 if you count the outlying farms. The population doubles in the warm months when the canal is running, because the boatmen and their families come and go, and the seasonal workers come, and the wagoners come down from the back country with their loads. The population shrinks by half in the winter, when the canal freezes and the boats are pulled up onto the bank and turned over for repairs, and the water in the locks goes still, and the ice on the surface gets thick enough to walk a horse across. Winter is its own season here, and we will come back to it. But for now, in our story, it is summer. The canal is open, the boats are running, the town is alive in the particular way that canal towns came alive between the months of April and November. The buildings of the town tell you everything about what it does for a living. Closest to the canal, on the side facing the towpath, are the warehouses. Big wooden buildings, 2 and 3 stories tall, with loading doors that open directly out over the water, so that a boat could be tied up alongside and the cargo could be hoisted up on a rope and pulleyed directly into the storage floor above. The smell of these warehouses is particular. Wheat. Always wheat in this part of New York, and underneath the wheat the smell of the canvas tarpaulins that protected the wheat from the rain, and underneath that the smell of the wood the building is made of, and underneath all of it the smell of the canal itself, which has its own quality. Slightly stagnant, slightly mineral, touched with the smell of the mules that have walked past the doorway 10,000 times. Just behind the warehouses, set back from the canal by maybe 50 feet, are the taverns and the chandlers and the feed stores. The taverns are doing the most business. There are 3 of them in a town of this size, which would seem like too many in any other context, but it is not too many here. There are at any given moment in the warm season perhaps 200 boatmen tied up within the limits of this town, and those boatmen, after 12 or 14 hours of work, want food and drink, and the company of other human beings who are not the same 3 people they have been on a boat with for the past week. The taverns provide all of that. They provide it loudly. The sound of a canal town tavern at 9 in the evening, the songs and the arguments and the occasional fights and the laughter and the fiddler in the corner who has been hired for the season, that sound carried out across the water, and was, for a great many people who lived along the canal, the sound of their evenings for 40 years. Past the taverns, on Main Street proper, are the more respectable establishments. The dry goods store run by a man named Mr. Thompson, who has been in this town since before the canal was completed. The post office, in the corner of Mr. Thompson's store, run by his wife. The doctor, who has an office above the dry goods store and who is the only doctor for 15 miles in any direction, and who is therefore extraordinarily busy. The bank, which is small and conservative, and which has, since opening in 1831, weathered exactly one panic that nearly closed it and recovered. The lawyer, who handles the property disputes that arise constantly along the canal, because property near the canal is valuable and property surveys in this period are imprecise. The newspaper, which prints once a week, and which is read by everyone in the town, and by a surprising number of people in surrounding towns who have it sent to them by mail. And rising above all of this, on a small hill that sits about a quarter-mile back from the canal, is the church, white clapboard, a spire that can be seen from the towpath for a mile in either direction, a graveyard behind it that has been filling up since the 1790s, before the canal, before the town in its present form. The church bell rings on Sundays and at funerals, and when there is a fire and when something significant has happened that the town as a whole needs to know about. The church bell is, in a way, the voice of the town speaking to itself. The lock gates speak to the canal. The church bell speaks to the people. I want to take you inside one of the houses in this town for a moment, because the houses tell a particular kind of story. The house I have in mind belongs to the lock tender, whose name is Samuel. He has worked these locks for 9 years. He came here from Massachusetts when his wife's brother, who lived in this town, wrote and said there was a position opening because the previous lock tender had taken a fall and broken his hip, and was no longer able to work the heavy gate handles. Samuel had been a millwright in Massachusetts, and he understood machinery, and he understood water, and the lock tender's job was a job that required understanding both. He came west with his wife and their 2 children. They have been here ever since. The house is small, 2 rooms downstairs, 2 rooms upstairs, a lean-to off the back that serves as a summer kitchen, so that the cooking heat does not warm the main house in the warm months. A privy out behind, set just at the edge of the kitchen garden. A well between the house and the canal lined with stone dug deep enough to be reliable through the dry months of August. A small barn for the cow and the chickens, that is the property. Inside, the front room is what the family uses for everything that is not sleeping. They eat there. They sit there in the evenings. The wife, whose name is Hannah, sews there in the afternoons. The children, when they were small, played there during the long winters when the cold made the upstairs rooms unusable for anything except sleeping under 3 quilts. The room has a fireplace, which the family uses in the warm months for cooking, and in the cold months for both cooking and heat. There is a small cast-iron cook stove also, which Hannah uses in preference to the fireplace whenever she can because the cook stove is faster and the heat is better controlled, and the cook stove was a wedding gift from her father, and she's used it for 16 years and would not give it up for anything. The cook stove sits to the left of the fireplace. They function as a unit. The fireplace heats. The cook stove cooks. Together they make the house livable. There is a table in the centre of the room, big enough for 6, although the family's only 4. The extra space is for visitors. In a canal town, you have visitors regularly. Boatmen who Samuel knew from a previous season and who are passing through with their families and who stop by for a meal. The Methodist preacher who comes for Sunday dinner once a month on the rotation he keeps with the families of his congregation. The blacksmith, who is Hannah's older brother, the same brother who wrote them about the lock tender position 9 years ago, who comes by perhaps 3 times a week because his own wife died in childbirth 4 years ago, and he eats a great many meals at his sister's table now. The doctor occasionally, when he is between calls and wants a cup of coffee. Visitors are a constant in this house. The table is big enough. There are 2 windows in the front room, both facing the canal. The light comes in through these windows for most of the day in the summer, because the canal runs roughly north and south through this town, and the sun moves across the southern sky and lights the front of the house from morning until evening. In the winter, the angle of the sun is lower, and the light comes in differently, but in the summer the front room is bright. Hannah does most of her sewing in this light. The windows have small panes of glass, 6 panes in each window set in wooden frames, that Samuel has had to repair several times because the wood swells with the moisture from the canal and warps, and the panes crack and need to be replaced. There is a cost associated with living near a canal that the people who live near a canal understand intimately. The moisture is one of those costs. Above the mantelpiece is a clock, 8-day, brass works, walnut case. It was a wedding gift to Samuel from his uncle in Boston, who had it shipped out to Massachusetts when Samuel and Hannah were married 18 years ago, and which they brought with them when they moved to New York. The clock keeps remarkably good time. Samuel winds it every Sunday morning before church. The clock is the only timepiece in the house. Time in this house, and in most houses in this town, is a more flexible thing than it is in the cities. The clock tells you when it's time for the family to gather for dinner. It tells you when Samuel needs to be at the lock for the morning shift change with the assistant lock tender, who lives in a smaller house on the other side of the lock. It tells you when the children need to be at school. Beyond that, the rhythm of the day is kept by other things. The light, the sound of the lock gates, the whistle of the packet boats coming around the bend, the smell of dinner cooking next door at the neighbours. There is no need for minute-by-minute timekeeping in a place where almost nothing happens that requires that kind of precision. Now I want to ask you something genuinely. When was the last time you spent a whole day without looking at a clock? Not just without checking the time, but without the clock being even a background presence in your awareness. It is a strange experience for most modern people, because modern life has been organised around precise timekeeping, in a way that 19th century life simply was not. The people in this town knew roughly what time it was. They could tell from the sun where they were in the day. They could tell from the church bell when it was noon and when it was 6. But they did not, in any meaningful sense, live by the minute the way we have come to. There is something about that I find genuinely freeing to contemplate. I'm not proposing we go back to it. I am simply noting that there are different ways of living inside a day, and the people in this town were living inside their day in a way that we have largely lost access to. The kitchen out behind the house, the lean-to summer kitchen, is the centre of Hannah's life from May through September. She moves the cooking out there as soon as the weather is reliably warm, and she does not move it back inside until the first hard frost in October. The summer kitchen has its own small stove, smaller than the one inside, and a long wooden work table that Samuel built for her the first summer they were here, and a set of shelves where she keeps the staples, flour, salt, sugar, when sugar is available, which is not always, and which is expensive and which is therefore used carefully, lard, coffee, which is roasted at home from green beans that come up the canal once a season, from a merchant who has connections to the New York docks, cornmeal, which is more reliable than wheat flour, and which Hannah uses for everything that does not specifically require wheat, salt pork in a barrel, which lasts for months and which is the foundation of a great many meals in this household, dried beans in a stoneware jar, dried apples hung from a string above the door where the breeze can keep them dry, onions hanging in a braid from a rafter, garlic in a smaller braid next to the onions. The kitchen smells on any given afternoon of what is going into supper: bread baking, bacon rendering, cabbage simmering with a piece of salt pork in a pot at the back of the stove. The cook stove is always going at this hour. Hannah is always doing several things at once. The mending in her lap when she sits down for a moment, the pot on the stove, the bread proofing on the counter, the chicken that needs to be plucked because she killed it this morning and saved the plucking for the afternoon when the children are home from school and can help her. The kitchen is a workshop. Hannah is the foreman. The output of this workshop is the survival of this household. I want to come back, before we end this section, to the lock itself, because the lock is the reason any of this exists. The lock is a stone chamber roughly 90 feet long and 15 feet wide. The walls are made of cut limestone, quarried locally, fitted together with mortar and clamped with iron straps where the joins needed extra strength. The chamber has 2 sets of gates, one at each end. Each gate is made of oak timbers, banded with iron, hinged on massive iron pintles set into the stone walls. Each gate weighs roughly 2,000 pounds. They open and close by hand. There is no machinery to assist. There is only a long wooden lever called a balance beam attached to the top of each gate, and the lock tender or his assistant pushes the balance beam to swing the gate open or closed. It takes a strong man to push the beam. It takes a stronger man to do it dozens of times a day for the whole season. When a boat approaches the lock from the east, travelling west, it whistles to let the lock tender know it is coming. The lock tender, who has been listening for the whistle, walks to the lock, opens the lower gates, lets the boat in, closes the lower gates behind it, and then opens the small valves in the upper gates that allow water from the higher level of the canal to flow into the chamber. The chamber fills. The boat rises with the water. When the chamber is full, the lock tender opens the upper gates. The boat moves out into the higher level of the canal. The lock tender closes the upper gates behind it, opens the lower gates again to drain the chamber back down, and waits for the next boat. The whole process takes perhaps 15 minutes for a single boat. In the busy hours of the morning, with traffic backed up in both directions, the lock tender does this dozens of times in succession, with barely a pause between cycles. The lock tender's day is structured around the lock the way a farmer's day is structured around livestock. The lock is alive in a sense. It needs to be tended, it needs to be watched, it needs to be repaired when the gates start to leak, which they do every year. It needs to be cleared of debris when a tree branch washes down, or a piece of cargo falls off a boat or a dead fish floats up from somewhere. The lock is the centre of Samuel's working life, and has been for 9 years. He stands at the lock now, in our story, in the early hours of the morning, listening for the first packet whistle of the day. The water is still in both the upper and lower levels because the night has been quiet and no boat has come through since around midnight. The sky is starting to pale. A faint mist is rising off the surface of the canal. He can hear, from the direction of his own house, the sound of Hannah pumping water at the well, which means she's up and starting the morning. He can hear from the warehouse 50 yards away the sound of someone moving around inside, which means the warehouse keeper is up and starting his own day. He can hear from somewhere further down the canal the soft whistle of a packet boat approaching, perhaps a quarter-mile out. The whistle tells him the boat will be here in perhaps 10 minutes. He has time to walk back to the house and have a cup of coffee from Hannah's pot before he needs to be back at the gates. He turns and walks back through the early light toward the small bright square of the kitchen window where Hannah has just lit the lamp. The first hour after dawn in a canal town has its own quality of sound and light that I want to spend some time with, because I think it is one of the things most worth recovering from this particular world. We have lost, in our cities and our suburbs, the experience of a place waking up gradually and audibly. Here, in 1843, in this town along the canal, you can stand on the towpath at 5 in the morning and hear the entire town beginning, layer by layer, in a sequence that is almost musical. The first sound, as I mentioned, is the lock gate. Samuel has come back to the lock with his coffee, and he has opened the lower gates for the packet boat that whistled a few minutes ago. The packet has come into the chamber, and the lower gates have closed, and the water is rising. There is the soft, continuous sound of water moving, a sound that is unlike any other sound, the sound of a controlled flow of considerable volume, passing through narrow openings in heavy oak. It is a sound you can lose yourself in. Samuel has been listening to it for 9 years and still finds it soothing. The second sound is the packet boat itself. The boat is one of the long, narrow passenger boats that ran on the canal in this period, 80 feet long, 14 feet wide, with a low cabin that ran almost the entire length of the deck. The packet has perhaps 30 people on board, most of them sleeping. The few who are awake are sitting on the benches that run along the cabin roof, which served as the upper deck, drinking coffee from tin cups that the boat steward has brought them. The boat is moving slowly even for canal speed because it is in the lock chamber, but the water rising under it gives the impression of motion. The boat is being lifted toward the upper level of the canal at a rate of about a foot every minute. The passengers on the cabin roof can watch the stone walls of the chamber dropping away below them as the boat rises. The third sound is the mules. They are tied up at the wharf alongside the packet on the towpath, waiting to be hitched up again once the boat is through the lock. There are 4 mules on this packet boat, working in 2 teams of 2, and the teams are switched out every 4 hours so that each team has time to rest. The mules currently waiting are the rested team. They are eating from feed bags that the driver has hung over their heads, and they are making the soft mule sounds of a hungry animal eating, which is one of the most peaceful sounds in the world if you have ever heard it. The mules know the routine. They have been doing this work for years. They will start walking again when the driver clucks at them and the line goes taut, and they will pull this boat for the next 4 hours along this stretch of the canal, and they will think, insofar as mules think about such things, of nothing in particular. The fourth sound is the rooster. There is always a rooster. The rooster lives in the small barn behind the closest tavern, and it begins to crow at exactly the same time every morning, regardless of the season. The rooster is, by general consensus among the town, more reliable than any clock. The rooster crows. The crowing carries across the canal. The rooster on the next farm answers it. Then the rooster 2 farms over. There is a chain of crowing that propagates outward from this town along the canal in both directions, and the chain is unbroken for as long as people are keeping chickens within earshot of each other. The fifth sound is Hannah at her well. The pump handle has its own particular squeak, a soft metallic complaint that she has heard so many times she does not consciously hear it any longer. She pumps water into a wooden bucket. She pumps until the bucket is full, which takes her about 30 strokes. She carries the bucket back to the kitchen. She pours half of it into the kettle on the cook stove and the other half into a basin on the work table for washing. She goes back out to the well and pumps another bucket because the kettle and the basin are not the only things that need water this morning. The cow needs water. The chickens need water. The kitchen garden needs water in this dry stretch of late August. Hannah will pump perhaps 8 buckets of water before breakfast. I want to talk about water for a moment, because water is one of those things that has changed so completely between the 1840s, and now that we sometimes forget it has changed at all. In this town, in this period, every drop of water that is used in the household has been pumped by someone, by hand, from a well, and carried by someone also by hand to wherever it is needed. The water for cooking, the water for washing dishes, the water for washing clothes, which is an enormous quantity of water, and which is one of the reasons washing clothes happens once a week, and is an all-day project. The water for bathing, which is also why bathing happens less frequently than we might expect. The water for the animals, the water for the kitchen garden. All of this water has been pumped by hand. Hannah pumps a great deal of water. She has the forearms of someone who pumps a great deal of water, although she does not think of her forearms in those terms. What I keep coming back to when I think about this is the relationship between effort and consumption. When you have to pump every drop of water you use, you become extraordinarily aware of how much water you are using. You do not leave the tap running. You do not waste it. You think carefully about whether the dishwater can be used for the chickens, whether the rinse water from the laundry can be used to wash the porch, whether the water you boiled the potatoes in can be saved for the soup. Nothing is wasted. Not because Hannah is particularly virtuous or thrifty, although she is both of those things, but because the alternative is pumping more water, and pumping more water means more time and more effort, and Hannah does not have unlimited time or effort. Constraint clarifies. The constraint of the well teaches you the value of every bucket. Now I want to ask you something. When was the last time you thought about how much water you used in a single day? Not in a guilty environmental sense, although there is room for that. Just in the sense of accounting, in the sense of knowing, in your hands, the weight of the water you needed to live for a day. The people in this town knew that weight. They knew it in their shoulders and in the muscle memory of pumping. They knew it the way you know your own breath. We have gained, in the century and a half since their time, an extraordinary thing. We have gained water that comes when we turn a handle. We have gained showers that run hot for 20 minutes. We have gained dishwashers and washing machines and irrigation systems. We have gained, in a word, abundance. What did we lose? I am not sure, but I think part of what we lost is the awareness of the gift. When water is constant, water becomes invisible. When water has to be pumped, water is one of the central facts of the day. The sixth sound, this is still the first hour of morning, is Mr. Halloran, the warehouse keeper, opening the loading doors of his warehouse. The loading doors are big and heavy, and they swing on iron hinges that need to be greased regularly. They have not been greased recently because Mr. Halloran has been busy with the late summer wheat harvest coming in from the farms, and the doors squeal when he opens them. The squeal is loud enough that Samuel, 50 yards away at the lock, hears it and makes a mental note that he should bring the grease bucket over later in the day if he has a chance. The squeal travels across the water. Mrs. Halloran, in the small house behind the warehouse, hears it from her kitchen and knows that her husband is up and working. She has been up for an hour already. She has the bread in the oven. She's starting on the eggs. Her husband will come in for breakfast in about 30 minutes, when the boat that is in the lock right now has been pulled up to the wharf and the morning's work has begun in earnest. The seventh sound is the children of the town starting to wake. There are perhaps 200 children in this town between the ages of 5 and 15, and most of them sleep in upstairs bedrooms in houses scattered across the town, and they are starting to come downstairs now in their nightshirts and their nightgowns, and to ask their mothers what is for breakfast. The children are part of the rhythm of the morning. The children will eat. The children will be sent to do their chores. The children, the boys mostly, will be sent to the canal to fetch water or to deliver messages or to run errands for their fathers. The girls will mostly stay closer to home, helping their mothers with the milking and the egg gathering and the preparation of breakfast. The children will go to school at 8, those of them whose families can spare them from the morning work, which is most of them in this period, because the canal economy is robust enough that most families do not need their children's labour in the way that purely agricultural families did. The children of this town are educated in the small schoolhouse at the edge of town. They learn to read and to write and to do basic arithmetic, and most of them, by the time they're 12, can read and write and do basic arithmetic competently. This is by the standards of 1940s, American education, an unimpressive level of literacy. By the standards of 1840s American rural education, it is actually quite good. I want to walk us, before we leave the first hour of morning, to the bakery. There is a small commercial bakery in this town, run by a German immigrant named Mr. Kuhn, who came to this country in 1838, and who set up his oven here because the canal traffic provided enough customers to support a bakery in a way that a small inland town could not. Mr. Kuhn has been up since 2 in the morning. The bread is baked in batches, and each batch needs to be in the oven for a particular length of time, and the oven needs to be at a particular temperature, and the only way to manage this is to be at the bakery before dawn, and to keep the oven going through the early morning so that the bread is ready when the boatmen come for it before they push off. The bread comes out of the oven at 5:30, 6, 6:30, 7 in successive batches. The smell of fresh bread fills the corner of the town where the bakery sits. The smell on a still summer morning can be detected from the lock 50 yards away. Samuel, working the gates, can smell Mr. Kuhn's bread, and the smell makes him hungry, and he reminds himself that Hannah has bread of her own at home, and that he will eat in another hour when the morning rush has eased. The bread that Mr. Kuhn makes is mostly rye. Rye is what the German baking tradition produced, and rye is also cheaper than wheat in this period, and the boatmen who buy bread from Mr. Kuhn are not particular about whether the bread is rye or wheat, as long as it is fresh and reasonably priced. Mr. Kuhn sells loaves at 3 cents each. A boatman going through this town will typically buy 2 loaves to take with him on the next leg of his journey. The bread will last him 3 or 4 days, depending on how big his crew is and how much they eat. The bread, by the 3rd or 4th day, will have hardened, and the boatmen will eat it dipped in coffee or in soup. Stale bread is not waste. Stale bread is just bread at a different stage of its life. Nothing in this economy is wasted. We will keep coming back to that, because it is one of the central truths of life in this period, and one of the things that has shifted most dramatically in the time since. The morning is filling out now. The first hour is past. The light has come up in earnest. Samuel has finished cycling the first packet through the lock and has walked back to his house for a quick breakfast that Hannah has waiting for him. Hannah has poured him coffee from the pot on the stove. The coffee is hot and strong and bitter. She has made him a plate with eggs and a slice of yesterday's bread fried in bacon grease, and a small portion of last night's beans warmed up. Samuel sits at the table and eats. The clock on the mantel ticks. The cook stove pops softly. Outside, the day has begun. Inside, for 10 minutes, there is the small, still pause of a man eating a meal his wife has made for him, before he goes back to work. This is, I want to suggest to you, one of the small forms of grace that this period had built into it. The pause, the breakfast at the table, the sitting down even briefly with the people you live with before the day takes you. We tend to think of life in this period as relentlessly hard, and it was hard in many ways, but there were also these spaces in it, these natural pauses that we have edited out of our own days in the name of efficiency. Samuel sits at his table. He eats, he drinks his coffee. He does not check his phone because there is no phone. He does not glance at a screen because there is no screen. He looks at his wife, who is moving around the kitchen behind him, and he looks at his cup of coffee and he looks out the window at the canal where his work is, and he eats. 10 minutes. Then he gets up, kisses Hannah on the temple, picks up his hat and goes back to the lock. The day takes him, but he had 10 minutes. I want you to come with me now onto the deck of a canal boat. The boat I have in mind is called the Mary Eliza. It is a line boat, sometimes called a freighter, distinct from the packet boats that carried passengers and from the smaller scoops that carried small loads of single commodities. The Mary Eliza is 78 feet long and 14 feet wide. It is built of oak planks over an oak frame, with a flat bottom because canals are shallow, and a flat-bottom boat draws less water than a keeled boat. It is painted dark green with red trim along the gunnels, although the paint is peeling in places because canal water and weather are hard on paint. The boat carries up to 70 tons of cargo. It is, in its functional design, one of the most efficient vehicles for moving bulk goods that has ever been built. It is also, for the family that lives on it, a home. The family is the Murphy family. There is the captain, Daniel Murphy, who is 41 years old. There is his wife, Margaret, who is 38. There are their 4 children. The oldest is Patrick, who is 14. Then there is Bridget, who is 11. Then there is Thomas, who is 8. The youngest is Catherine, called Kate, who is 5. The Murphy family lives on this boat from April through November every year. They have been doing it for 13 years. Patrick was born on this boat. Bridget was born on this boat. Thomas was born in a rented room in Buffalo because Margaret happened to be there when her labour began. Kate was born on this boat. The boat has, in addition to the cargo hold, which takes up most of the length of the vessel, a small cabin at the stern. The cabin is 12 feet long and 12 feet wide. It contains everything the family needs to live. There is a small cast iron stove for cooking and heating. There is a table that folds down from the wall when it is needed, and folds back up against the wall when it is not. There is a bench along one wall that serves as seating during the day, and as a sleeping berth for one of the older children at night. There are 2 bunks built into the wall, one above the other, where Daniel and Margaret sleep on the lower one, and where 2 of the children sleep on the upper one. There is a smaller bunk on the opposite wall where the other 2 children sleep, top and tail sharing a single mattress. There are pegs along the walls where coats and shawls hang. There are shelves, narrow and tightly built, where Margaret keeps the dishes and the cookware and the small store of food that the family draws on between provisioning stops. The cabin is small. It is significantly smaller than the locktender's house we just left. It is, by any modern standard, almost impossibly small for a family of 6, and yet they live in it. They live in it in a way that has by this point become so familiar to them that they hardly notice the smallness of it. They have figured out where to put everything. They have figured out how to move around each other. They have figured out the little tricks of folding, of stacking, of organising, that allow 6 people to coexist in 12 feet by 12. The boat is a kind of marvel of small space living. It anticipates by a century every philosophy of efficient living that the 20th and 21st centuries would later embrace. The cabin smells of certain things consistently. Cooking. The stove is small, but it is in use most of the day, and the smells of breakfast and dinner and the late evening tea linger in the small space. Kerosene, from the lamp that hangs from a hook in the centre of the ceiling. Wet wool, in the cold months, from the coats and shawls drying on the pegs. Tobacco, from Daniel's pipe, which he smokes in the cabin in the evenings. Coffee, always coffee, because Margaret keeps a pot on the stove most of the day. Bread, when she's baking, which is twice a week. The river. The canal water, which has its own particular smell that you eventually stop noticing if you live on it, but that any visitor to the boat would identify immediately as the dominant note. And the smell of bodies, of 6 people living in close quarters, which is not unpleasant exactly, but which is real, and which is part of what living together in this kind of space means. Margaret has organised the cabin to within an inch of its capacity. Every cubic foot has a function. The space under the lower bunk is storage for the family's clothing, packed into wooden trunks that slide in and out as needed. The space under the table, when the table is folded down, is where the wash basin sits. The space above the stove, on a small drying rack, is where the wet dish rags hang. The walls, as I mentioned, hold the pegs. The shelves hold the kitchenware and the dry goods. There is a small cabinet under the bench where Margaret keeps her sewing basket, her medicine box, her important papers in a tin can that she sealed shut after wrapping the papers in oilcloth. The medicine box contains laudanum for pain, camphor for sore throats, a bottle of whiskey for cuts and for shock, a jar of bear grease for skin problems, a bag of dried herbs that Margaret picked herself the previous fall and that she uses for various small ailments. The papers contain the marriage certificate, the children's birth records when they exist, which is not always, because boats do not always pass through towns where births can be officially registered, the deed to a small plot of land in a town near Albany that Daniel's mother left him when she died, and a small bundle of letters from Margaret's sister in Connecticut that she has saved and reread many times. The day on the boat begins early, but not as early as the day at the lock. Margaret is up at 5:30. She lights the stove, she sets the coffee pot on. She mixes the dough for the morning's biscuits, which she lets rest for 15 minutes while she goes up on deck and uses the privy that hangs over the stern of the boat. The privy is a small wooden enclosure. There is a hole. The hole opens directly onto the water below. Privacy is achieved by closing the door. Sanitation is achieved by the canal current, which is gentle but persistent. The privy is one of the things about life on a boat that any visitor would have an opinion about. The family has long since stopped having opinions about it. It is just the privy. By the time Margaret has come back down to the cabin, the stove is hot enough to put the biscuits on. She slides the pan into the small oven compartment. She pours herself coffee. She wakes Daniel, who has been asleep, by saying his name softly. He opens his eyes. He has slept in his clothes the way he often does when they have an early start. He sits up. He drinks the coffee that Margaret has put on the table for him. He rubs his face. He looks at his wife. She looks back at him. There is a small moment between them, the kind of moment that happens between people who have been married for 16 years and who know each other in ways that do not require speech. Then he gets up, puts on his hat, and goes out on deck. Up top, Daniel checks the lines that hold the boat to the wharf. He checks the cargo, which is a load of barrelled flour bound for Albany, to make sure none of it shifted in the night. He looks down the canal, in the direction they will be heading, and notes the conditions. The water is calm, the mist is rising, there is no wind, which is good for canal travel, because wind on a canal can push a boat sideways and make steering difficult. He estimates the day's run. They will leave the wharf at 6:30 after breakfast. They will reach the next lock at 7:30. They will reach the town 12 miles east at 11. They will stop there to provision. They will continue on at noon. They will reach the next major town at 5 in the afternoon. They will tie up there for the night. That is the day. He has done this same kind of calculation every morning of every travelling season for the past 13 years. He could do it in his sleep. Patrick, the oldest son, is up next. Patrick is 14 and has been working as the steerer for 3 years now. The steerer stands at the back of the boat and operates the long wooden tiller that controls the rudder. The rudder is what keeps the boat in the centre of the canal. Steering a canal boat is not difficult exactly, but it requires constant attention. The boat tends to drift toward the towpath because that is the side the towline pulls from. The steerer must constantly correct. A boat that drifts too close to the bank can hit the bottom or tear up the bank. A boat that drifts too far from the bank can swing wide and create problems for boats coming the other way. The steerer's job is to keep the boat in the proper line for the entire length of the day's run. It is a job that requires steadiness, attention, and the kind of patience that 14-year-old boys are not famous for, but Patrick has it. He has learned it. He has been raised to it. He stands at the tiller now in the morning chill with his hat pulled low and a piece of the bread Margaret made yesterday in his hand, watching the canal ahead of them and waiting for his father to give the word that they are ready to push off. The mules are tied up to a hitching post at the wharf. The mules are owned by the boat itself, which is to say, by the family. There are 4 of them. 2 are working today, 2 are resting. They will be switched out at midday. The mules' names are Rose, Ginny, Pete and Hank. Rose and Ginny are working today. The mule driver, who's a 15-year-old boy named Frank Connors, who came out from a farm near Utica 2 seasons ago, and signed on with the Murphys for the wages and the change of scenery, is hitching them up to the towline now. Frank is not part of the family, but he eats with the family and sleeps in a small berth that the captain rigged up for him in the bow of the boat, and he is treated with the casual familiarity that you would treat a younger cousin. He will work this season and decide at the end of November whether he wants to come back next spring or whether he wants to try something else. Most boys who sign on as mule drivers do not stay for more than 2 or 3 seasons. The work is hard, the pay is modest, the walking is endless. I want to come back to that walking because the mule driver's experience of canal life is its own particular thing, and we will give it a section of its own further on. But for now, just notice this. The boat moves at 3 miles an hour. Frank walks alongside the mules on the towpath for the entire time the boat is moving. If the boat moves for 10 hours in a day, which is normal in the busy season, Frank walks for 10 hours. He walks something like 30 miles a day. He does this 6 days a week with Sunday off in most cases because the canal companies forbade Sunday traffic in the early decades, although enforcement varied. Frank walks from April to November. By the end of the season, his boots are completely worn out and he buys a new pair before he goes home for the winter. The mule driver's life is a walking life. The towpath is his world for those 8 months of the year. Margaret calls everyone to breakfast. The children come down into the cabin. Patrick comes in from the deck. Daniel comes in. They sit around the small folded-down table, 6 of them in 12 feet by 12, and they eat the biscuits and the salt pork and the coffee. Kate, the youngest, sits on her mother's lap because there is not quite enough room for everyone to have their own seat. Thomas, the 8-year-old, has been told 3 times to keep his elbows off the table, and is on his 4th attempt to comply. Bridget, the 11-year-old, is reading a book under the table, which her mother has not yet noticed but will in a minute. The book is one of the McGuffey readers, which the family carries on board for the children's education, since the children obviously cannot attend a regular school given that they are on a moving boat. Margaret teaches them in the cabin during the slow hours and the rainy days and the evenings when the boat is tied up. Bridget is reading ahead in the reader because she finds the lessons more interesting than the conversations at breakfast. Margaret notices the book. Margaret tells Bridget to put it away. Bridget puts it away. Bridget will pick it up again the moment breakfast is over. The breakfast lasts about 15 minutes. Then everyone has a job to do. Daniel goes back up on deck to oversee the push-off. Patrick goes to the tiller. Frank Connors gets the mules going. Margaret stays in the cabin to wash the breakfast dishes and to start the day's other work, which will include mending Thomas's torn pants, baking bread for tomorrow, churning butter from yesterday's cream, and supervising the younger children's reading lessons. The children, except for Patrick and except for the youngest 2 who will spend the day with their mother in the cabin, will spend most of the day on the deck. Bridget, who is past the age where she can be safely contained in the cabin, and who is also old enough to be useful, will help on deck. Thomas will run errands and hand things to people and stay out of the way. Kate will be with Margaret, sometimes on deck, sometimes in the cabin, depending on the weather and on what Margaret is doing. The boat pushes off. The line goes taut. Rose and Ginny lean into the harness. The boat begins to move. The water at the stern parts in a slow V that travels back along the canal until it loses itself in the mist. Patrick at the tiller corrects gently to keep the boat in line. Frank on the towpath walks at the mule's pace. The boat is underway. It is 6:33 in the morning. The day has begun for the Murphy family, and it will not end until the boat ties up again somewhere around 5 or 6 in the evening, perhaps 50 miles east of here. Until then, the work goes on. The boat moves. The water flows around the hull at 3 miles an hour. The mules walk. The boy walks. The captain watches. The wife in the cabin keeps the small home in motion. The children, as children always do their lessons and dream of something else. I want to tell you about Frank Connors now, and through him about the whole class of boys who walk the towpaths of America in this period, because their experience of canal life is one of the most particular and least documented, and I have been thinking about it lately in ways I cannot quite let go of. Frank is 15. He came up the canal 2 summers ago from a farm near Utica, where his father raises wheat and dairy cows on 120 acres that his grandfather cleared in the 1790s. Frank is the 3rd son. His older brothers will inherit. He will not. The family farm cannot support 7 adult sons, and Frank, like the boys who came before him in his particular family situation, has been pushed gently and not entirely unkindly out into the world to find his own way. He could have taken work as a hired hand on a neighbouring farm. He could have gone west. He could have apprenticed himself to a tradesman, although the trades were full and the apprenticeships hard to come by. He chose the canal because his cousin Tim, 2 years older than Frank, had spent a season on the canal and had come home in November with $28 in his pocket, which was more cash money than Frank had ever seen in one place in his life. $28 for a teenage boy in 1843 was not nothing. $28 would buy a good winter coat, a new pair of boots, a small contribution to the family, and still leave you with enough to put aside for the next season's needs. Frank thought about it for a week and then walked the 17 miles to the canal, found a captain who needed a mule driver, and signed on for $1.50 a week plus board. $1.50 a week. That is what the work paid. If you worked a 30-week season, which most drivers did, you would clear $45 before any deductions, and then there would be deductions, because if you broke a piece of harness or lost a tool, you were charged for it. And if you took your meals on shore at any point, you paid for those meals out of your own pocket. And if you needed new boots, which you would, the boots came out of your wages. By the end of the season, after deductions, a careful boy could come home with somewhere between $25 and $35. A careless boy might come home with $15. A boy who had spent his pay in the canal town taverns at the end of each leg might come home with $5. The variation in outcomes had everything to do with the boy's discipline and almost nothing to do with the work itself, which paid what it paid regardless. The work was walking, the walking was the work. I've said this already, but I want to say it again because I think it is hard for modern people to fully grasp what this means. Frank walks behind the mules, on the towpath, at the pace of the mules, which is about 3 miles an hour. He walks for as long as the boat is moving. The boat usually moves from 6:30 in the morning until somewhere around 5 or 6 in the evening, with a stop in the middle of the day for the mules to be switched out and watered, and shorter stops at locks and at towns where the boat needs to do business. The walking time, in a typical day, is somewhere between 9 and 10 hours. The walking distance, at 3 miles an hour, is somewhere between 27 and 30 miles. Frank walks the equivalent of a marathon every day. He does this 6 days a week. He has been doing it since April. He will keep doing it through November. By the end of the season, he will have walked, conservatively, 4,000 miles. The towpath, by the end of the season, will have a particular quality to him that no one who has not walked it for a season can quite understand. It will be his world. He will know every dip in it, every spot where the dirt turns muddy after a rain, every place where the brush comes too close to the path, every farmhouse visible from it, every angle of the canal, every tree along its banks. The path will be in his bones. The walking, you might think, would be exhausting, and it is for the first 3 weeks of the season. After that, something strange happens, the body adjusts, the legs become stronger than the legs of any farm boy or any town boy, or any boy who's not himself a canal driver. The feet harden. The pace becomes natural. The walking becomes, as walking does for anyone who walks consistently for many months, almost effortless. Frank by August can walk 30 miles in a day and feel at the end of it ready to walk 5 more if he needed to. The body is a remarkable instrument. It will adapt to almost any sustained demand placed on it. The driver's bodies adapt to the towpath. What does not adapt as easily as the mind? The walking is monotonous. There is the mule in front of you, the canal beside you, the path under you, the sky above you, the boat 50 feet behind you on the water. That is your environment. It does not change much for hours at a time. Some boys handled this well, some boys did not. The boys who handled it well found things to do with their minds while they walked. They thought about home. They thought about the stories they had read. They composed letters in their heads that they would write down later when they had a paper and ink. They sang. They sang a great deal, actually, the canal drivers, because singing made the walking go faster, and because there were a number of canal songs that had developed specifically for this purpose. Songs you sang to your mules, songs you sang to keep yourself company, songs you sang to mark the miles. There was a song called the Erie Canal that almost every driver knew. There was a song called Lowbridge, Everybody Down. There was a song about a mule named Sal that started the same way every time, and that boys would add new verses to as the seasons went on, until the song had hundreds of verses and no one driver knew them all. The songs are part of what got the boys through the long days. The songs are also one of the things that the Canal era left behind to American culture. We still know some of those songs. They have outlasted the canals themselves. Frank himself is not a great singer. He hums. He composes long imagined letters to his mother that he never quite gets around to writing down. He thinks about food. He thinks, at 15, almost constantly about food, which is what 15-year-old boys think about, and the walking only sharpens his appetite. He looks forward to lunch with the kind of focus that you might use today, to look forward to a vacation. Lunch is the one bright spot in the middle of his day. Lunch is when he gets to sit down for 15 minutes and eat what Margaret has packed for him in a tin lunch pail, which is usually bread and cheese and a piece of cold meat and an apple if apples are in season. He sits on the bank of the canal. He eats. He drinks water from his canteen. He watches the boat that he has been pulling along, tied up at whatever wharf or stretch of shore the captain has chosen for the midday stop. He has 15 minutes. Then he gets up and harnesses the rested team of mules, ties up the team that has just worked, and starts walking again. The walking resumes. The afternoon begins. Now I want to be honest about something else, because I think this part is important, and I think it tends to get glossed over in romanticised accounts of the Canal era. The work was lonely. It was lonely in a way that is hard to describe to people who have not done isolated outdoor work for long stretches. Frank on the towpath has the mules in front of him. The mules are not company, the mules are work. He has the boat 50 feet behind him on the water, but the boat is moving with him, and shouting back and forth across 50 feet of water for 10 hours a day is not a substitute for actual conversation. He sees other boats passing. He nods to the drivers on the other boats, sometimes exchanges a word or two as they pass, but the encounters are brief. Most of the day he is alone. He walks, he thinks, he gets through it. The boys handled the loneliness in different ways. Some made friends in the towns where they tied up at night, friendships that were renewed each time the boat returned to that town, friendships that lasted for seasons and sometimes for years. Some sought out the taverns and the rougher entertainments that canal towns offered, and some of those boys came to bad ends, drinking too much or getting into fights or getting into trouble of more serious kinds. The Canal era had its share of teenage casualties, boys who fell off boats and drowned, boys who were kicked by mules and died of infections, boys who were robbed and beaten in alleys behind taverns, boys who simply walked off into the woods one evening and were never seen again. The historical record is incomplete because the canal companies did not keep careful records of mule drivers, who were considered casual labour, and the boys themselves often did not have families who could be notified or who would think to ask after them. The canal swallowed a certain number of boys every year. This was understood. This was part of the cost of the work. Some boys also did extraordinarily well. They saved their wages, they learned the canal, they worked their way up. A boy who started as a mule driver at 15 could, by 20, be a steerer earning twice the wages, and by 25 could be a captain himself running his own boat, and by 30 could own a boat and a team of mules and a small piece of land. The canal was, for the right kind of young man, a ladder. The ladder was real. Frank's cousin Tim, the one who had earned $28 his first season, was now in his third year on the canal and was running a small line boat of his own as a captain, having borrowed against his father's farm to buy the boat and the mules, and having paid back the loan within 2 years. Tim was 20. He had a future. Frank had been watching Tim's career closely and was thinking, when he had time to think between mules and meals, that he might follow that same path himself if he could manage the money. I want to ask you something. When you were 15, what were you doing? And I do not mean this as a comparison or a judgment. I genuinely just want you to think about it for a moment, because the boys who walked these towpaths were boys. They were not small men, they were boys. They were the same age as ninth graders today. They were doing work that very few adults today would willingly do, in conditions that very few adults today would willingly accept, and they were doing it for wages that, even adjusted for the period, were not generous. They were doing it because there were not many other options for boys in their situation, and because the work, hard as it was, did pay, and because there was a certain freedom in it. They were on the canal. They were not on the farm. They were seeing parts of the country they would not otherwise have seen. They were meeting people they would not otherwise have met. They were, in the deepest sense, encountering the world. That counts for something. It counted for everything to a great many of the boys who walk these paths. The afternoon stretches on. Frank walks. The sun, which has been climbing all morning, reaches its peak around 1. The shadows shorten. The day becomes hot, the way August days become hot, and the canal water, which had been cool in the morning, becomes warmer to the eye. The mules sweat. Frank sweats. The mule sweat has its own smell, which is different from horse sweat, sharper somehow, and which mixes with the smell of the canal and the smell of the towpath dust to make the particular summer afternoon smell of a working canal, a smell that anyone who lived through this era would recognize instantly, and that no one alive today has ever smelled in its complete original form. The smells of history are one of the things we have most fully lost. We have the photographs and the documents and the songs. We do not have the smells. We can imagine them, the way I am asking you to imagine them now, but we cannot quite recover them. Frank, in his life, smells this canal every day for 8 months a year. The smell is woven into him. The smell, when he is an old man 50 years from now in 1893, will come back to him sometimes when he passes a stagnant pond on a hot day, and the memory of his canal years will return to him in full, and he will stop on whatever sidewalk he's standing on and breathe in deeply and let the past have its moment. The afternoon shift wears on. Frank watches the canal ahead. The boat behind him moves at its steady 3 miles. The mules pull, the miles accumulate. By 4 in the afternoon, they have covered another 12 miles since the midday stop. They are approaching the next major town. Frank can see in the distance the church spire that marks it. He can see, closer in, the smoke from the warehouses where afternoon work is in full progress. He can see boats tied up at the wharves. He can hear faintly the sound of the lock gates opening and closing for incoming traffic. The afternoon is winding toward its end. The day is winding toward its end. In another hour or 2, the boat will tie up. Frank will unhitch the mules and lead them to a stable in the town where they will spend the night. Frank will eat with the family. Frank will sleep in his small berth in the bow of the boat, or, if the weather is good, on a blanket spread out on the towpath beside the boat under the stars. Frank will sleep deeply because he has walked 30 miles. Tomorrow he will get up before dawn and do it all again. This is the rhythm of his life from April to November. This is the rhythm of the lives of perhaps 15,000 boys across the canal system of the United States in this period. They walked. They walked the country into a connected economic whole. They walked the wheat from Buffalo to Albany. They walked the salt from Syracuse to New York. They walked the coal from Pennsylvania to wherever coal was needed. The country grew, in those decades, on the strength of their walking. We do not have monuments to them. We probably should. Let us go back to Samuel now. We have been with him at intervals all morning, but I want to spend some real time at his lock, because the lock tender's life is one of the strangest and most particular ways of making a living that the canal era produced, and it is worth understanding in some detail. Samuel was hired by the New York Canal Commission at a salary of $300 a year. That was the standard rate for a lock tender on the Erie Canal in this period. $300 annually, paid quarterly, with the use of a lockhouse provided as part of the compensation. The lockhouse in Samuel's case is the small 2-story house we visited earlier, the one where Hannah keeps her summer kitchen and where the 8-day clock sits on the mantel. The house is owned by the commission. Samuel and his family live in it as long as Samuel holds the position. If Samuel were to lose the position, or to retire, or to die, the family would have to vacate within 30 days. The arrangement is not quite tenancy, but is also not quite ownership. It is something in between, particular to canal employment, and it shaped the lives of lock tenders and their families in ways that ordinary homeowners would not have understood. $300 a year is not a great deal of money. By way of comparison, a skilled craftsman in this period, a carpenter or a blacksmith, might earn $500 or $600 a year if he had steady work. A factory operative in the textile mills of New England earned perhaps $200. A farm labourer earned $120. A clerk in a city counting house earned $400. The lock tender's $300 put him in the middle of the wage spectrum. It was reliable. It was steady. It came with the house. For a man like Samuel, who had been a millwright in Massachusetts but who had not had steady work for the year before his brother-in-law wrote him about the lock tender opening, $300 a year and a house had been more than acceptable. It had been a kind of salvation. It still is. The job, to describe it plainly, is to operate the lock, to open and close the gates, to maintain the gates and the chamber, to keep the lock in working order at all hours of the day and night during the navigation season, to keep records of the boats that pass through, recording the boat name and the captain's name and the cargo and the time of passage in a ledger that the commission requires, to collect tolls in some cases, though in the period we are discussing, toll collection has been mostly transferred to dedicated waylock stations, and Samuel does not have to handle money on most days, to watch for problems, to raise an alarm if something goes wrong, to be present. The presence is the central thing. A lock tender is, in the most fundamental sense, a presence. He is at the lock. He is there when boats arrive. He is there when boats need to be locked through. He is there at all hours. The canal does not run from 9 to 5. Boats come at all times during the navigation season, and the lock tender must be available to lock them through whenever they arrive. In practice, this means that Samuel is on call from April through November, 7 days a week, with the exception of Sunday mornings when canal traffic is forbidden by commission rule, and when Samuel attends church with his family. The rest of the time, day or night, Samuel must be ready to come to the lock if a boat whistles for service. Samuel has his ways of managing this. He has an assistant lock tender named Joseph, who covers the lock during certain hours so that Samuel can sleep, although the division is informal and depends on agreements between the two men rather than any official scheduling by the commission. Joseph lives in a smaller house on the other side of the lock, also commission-owned, and he and Samuel split the day in a rough fashion, with Samuel working from roughly 4 in the morning until 8 at night, and Joseph covering from 8 at night until 4 in the morning. Neither man works the entire shift continuously. They are on call within their shift. They sleep when no boats are coming. They are awakened by the whistle when boats arrive. The arrangement works, more or less. There are nights when Samuel does not sleep at all because boat traffic is heavy. There are nights when both men sleep all night because no boats come. The variation is part of the work. The lock itself, as I described it earlier, is a stone chamber with 2 sets of gates. The gates need to be operated by hand. The water needs to flow through the valves to fill or drain the chamber. The whole apparatus needs maintenance. Samuel's working life has a certain repetitive quality that after 9 years has become so deeply familiar that he could perform the operations in complete darkness if he had to. He knows the weight of each gate. He knows how many turns of the valve handle are required to fully open or close the water flow. He knows how long it takes to fill the chamber, which varies depending on the level of the canal above and the time since the last cycling. He knows the sound the gates make when they are seated correctly versus when they are not. He knows the small tells of a gate that is going to need repair soon, the slight stickiness in the hinge, the small leak in the seal. The maintenance is constant. Wood, when it sits in water for years on end, deteriorates. The oak gates, however well built, need to be replaced every 15 or 20 years, and the iron banding needs to be repaired or replaced more often than that. The stone walls of the chamber need to be repointed every 5 or 6 years because the mortar washes out. The valves need to be ground and reseated annually. The chamber needs to be drained periodically and cleaned of the debris that accumulates at the bottom, which can be considerable, because boats lose things and people throw things, and the canal carries things downstream that all eventually settle in the lock chambers. Samuel does some of this maintenance himself. The commission sends a maintenance crew through the system every spring to do the larger work, the gate replacements and the major repointing. Samuel does the daily and weekly upkeep. There is a particular skill that lock tenders develop, which is the ability to read a boat as it approaches. A boat coming into the lock at the wrong angle, or carrying too much cargo, or being driven by an inexperienced captain can damage the lock. Lock tenders learn to spot trouble before it happens. Samuel has, over 9 years, developed an almost instantaneous read of any boat that approaches his lock. He can tell, from a quarter-mile out, whether the boat is being handled competently. He can tell, from the sound of the boat's whistle, whether the captain is in a hurry or not. He can tell when the boat enters the chamber, whether the boat is loaded properly. If something is wrong, Samuel adjusts his procedure. He may close the gates slowly to give the boat time to settle. He may run the water more gently to avoid surging the boat against the walls. He may, in extreme cases, refuse passage and require the boat to wait or to redistribute its cargo. The lock tender has authority over the lock. The captain, in the lock, defers to the lock tender. This is one of the rules of canal life, and it is generally observed, although there are captains who chafe at it, and lock tenders who must occasionally remind a recalcitrant captain whose authority prevails. The relationship between lock tenders and boat captains is in general friendly. The same captains pass through the same locks year after year, and the men come to know each other. There is a small fraternity of canal workers, and the lock tenders are part of it, and there is a great deal of conversation that happens at locks while boats are cycling through. The captain stands on the deck. The lock tender stands by the gate handle. The minutes pass while the chamber fills or drains. The two men talk. They talk about weather. They talk about the price of wheat. They talk about news from the cities. They talk about other people they both know. They talk about the small troubles of the canal, the boats that have broken down, the captains who have retired, the boys who are now coming along as new drivers. The lock cycle is 15 minutes long. Most lock conversations are about that long. They are a particular form of human contact, brief but recurring, that punctuates the days of lock tenders and captains for entire careers. Samuel has had hundreds of these conversations over 9 years with the same captains. He knows the names of their wives. He knows the names of their boats. He knows their stories. They know his. I want to come back to Hannah for a moment, because the lock tender's wife has her own particular version of this life, and it is worth describing. Hannah is, in a practical sense, a partner in Samuel's job. She's not paid by the commission. The commission does not officially recognise her existence. But she works alongside Samuel in ways that are essential to the operation of the lock. When Samuel is at the gates, and a problem arises that requires another set of hands, Hannah is the person Samuel calls. When the maintenance crew arrives in the spring, Hannah is the person who feeds them. When boatmen arrive who need to wait at the lock for some reason, Hannah is the person who provides the water and the food they may need. When the doctor needs to be summoned because someone has been hurt at the lock, Hannah is the person who runs to fetch him. The lock, in the way that family-run businesses worked in this era, is operated by a unit of 2 adults, even though only one of them is officially employed. Hannah also keeps the records when records need to be kept. Samuel is not a strong reader or writer. He can do both, but slowly, and he is not comfortable with the ledger work that the commission requires. Hannah, who is the daughter of a schoolteacher in Massachusetts and who can read and write fluently, does the ledger entries for Samuel in her careful handwriting every evening before bed. She fills in the boat names, the captain names, the cargo, the time of passage. She's been doing this for 9 years. The ledgers, when historians eventually look at them in the archives of the New York State Library a century later, will have been kept entirely in Hannah's handwriting, although the official lock tender of record is Samuel. This was common across the canal system. The wives kept the books. The wives are largely invisible in the official records of canal employment. The wives did the work anyway. I find myself thinking about this often when I think about the canal era. The men get the credit. The men get the records. The men are listed in the commission's employment registers and in the histories of the canal that came later. The women, whose work was equally essential, are mostly invisible. We know about Hannah because I am inventing her, frankly, as a representative of the thousands of lock tenders' wives who lived this life. The actual Hannahs are not, in most cases, remembered by name. The work they did has been folded into the work their husbands did. The credit in the historical record has gone where the credit usually goes. This is one of the small injustices of the way history is preserved. The day for Samuel and Hannah continues. The morning rush has eased. There is a longer pause now between boats, perhaps 30 or 40 minutes between cycles. Samuel uses the pause to do small maintenance tasks, to sharpen the tools in the small workshop he keeps in a shed near the lock, to splice a length of rope that needs splicing, to grease the hinges of one of the smaller valves. Hannah uses her morning to bake bread and to start the preparations for the noon meal. The children, who are home from school for the summer, are doing their assigned chores. Patrick, the older son, is helping his uncle the blacksmith for the morning, which is part of an informal apprenticeship that the family has worked out. The younger daughter, Rebecca, is helping her mother in the kitchen. The youngest son, Edward, is doing whatever his mother tells him to do, which at the moment is cleaning the chicken coop, a task he hates and which she insists upon. The household runs. By the time I'm closing this section, it is mid-morning. The mist has burned off the canal. The light is full now, and the day has the particular bright clarity of a late summer morning in upstate New York. Samuel stands at the lock with his hand on the gate handle, watching the next boat approach. The boat's a familiar one, a packet that runs this stretch of the canal twice a week, and Samuel waves to the captain as the boat comes into view. The captain waves back. The day is going to be long. The day is also going to be exactly like the day before it and the day after it, and Samuel finds, after 9 years, that he does not mind this. There is a comfort in the repetition. There is a settledness. The lock works. The water flows. The boats come through. The family is fed. The house stands. The town goes on. The canal carries the country forward, foot by foot, 3 miles an hour, year after year, in a slow, steady current of work and water and human purpose. Samuel, in his small place on this larger thing, does his part. Let me take you now to the most lively building in this town, which is the tavern called the Black Horse, which sits 40 feet from the canal at the corner of Main Street and Lock Street, and which has been doing business at this location since 1828, 3 years after the canal opened. The Black Horse is a 2-story wooden building painted white, with a wide front porch that runs the full length of the building, and that has, on warm evenings, 8 or 10 chairs set out on it for boatmen who want to drink their beer outside in the cooler air. The first floor of the building contains the tap room, which takes up the front, and the dining room behind it, which is smaller and more formal, and where families and respectable travellers eat. Behind the dining room is the kitchen, and behind the kitchen is a small yard with a privy, a hand pump, and a stable for the horses of guests who arrive overland. The second floor contains 6 small bedrooms, which are rented out to overnight guests, and a single larger room at the end of the hall, which is occupied by the proprietor and his wife. The whole building is heated in the winter by 2 wood stoves, one in the tap room and one in the dining room, and by smaller stoves in each of the upstairs bedrooms, which are lit only when guests are paying for the room. The Black Horse is, by any measure, a working establishment. It is not fancy. It is not trying to be fancy. It is trying to be reliably full of paying customers from April through November, and it succeeds at this aim with considerable consistency. The proprietor is a man named Daniel O'Brien. He is 48 years old. He came to this country from County Cork in 1825, the year the canal opened, which was a coincidence of timing that he has retold so many times over the years that he can no longer remember whether he originally meant it as a meaningful coincidence or whether it was always just a thing he said to fill the silence at the bar. His wife, Mary, is 45. She runs the kitchen and the upstairs rooms, and she manages the cleaning girl Lizzie, who comes in 6 days a week and does the laundry and the floors and the general scrubbing that an establishment of this kind requires. The O'Briens have 3 children, all grown now, all gone. The oldest son went west to Wisconsin 5 years ago and is doing well, by the accounts of his letters, on a piece of land near Madison. The daughter married a clerk from Albany and lives there now, and writes once a month with news of her own 3 children. The youngest son, who was the disappointment of the family, drank himself out of 3 positions in 3 different cities and was last heard from a year ago in St. Louis, doing what no one in the family is quite sure. The O'Briens carry the worry about him quietly. They do not talk about it much. Mary lights a candle for him every Sunday at the Catholic Church, of which more in a moment. The tap room is the heart of the establishment. It is a long room, roughly 30 feet by 20, with a low ceiling and exposed wooden beams. The bar runs along one side, a long polished plank of oak that Daniel keeps wiped clean throughout the day. Behind the bar are shelves with bottles, whiskey mostly of various qualities, rum, some gin, a few bottles of brandy for the more particular customers, although these sell slowly, a keg of beer, which Daniel taps from a cellar where the cool earth keeps the beer drinkable through the warm months. The beer is the most popular item by volume. The whiskey is the most popular by price. The customers, mostly boatmen, mostly drink 1 or 2 glasses of whiskey or 2 or 3 glasses of beer over the course of an evening, and most of them eat at the bar or at the small tables that fill the rest of the room, and most of them are out the door by 10 in the evening because they have early starts the next morning. The walls of the tap room are decorated with the usual things that taproom walls are decorated with. A few prints, including a famous one of George Washington crossing the Delaware that Daniel bought from a peddler 10 years ago, a pair of crossed oars over the doorway, a clock, which keeps reasonably good time, a chalkboard where Daniel writes the day's specials, a handwritten sign that reads "No Credit," which Daniel posted 10 years ago after several unfortunate experiences with boatmen who promised to pay on their next trip through and who failed to materialise, and which has been the firm policy of the establishment ever since. The sign is honoured mostly. There are exceptions for old customers and for known captains and for the occasional traveller who clearly has fallen on temporary hard times. But the policy is generally enforced, and the establishment is solvent, and Daniel keeps the books carefully. The food is served from a smaller chalkboard which Mary updates each morning. The menu changes by the day depending on what is fresh and what needs to be used up. A typical day's offerings might include beef stew, which Mary makes in a large pot in the morning and which simmers all day on the back of the stove, boiled potatoes, which are always available, salt pork, which is always available, often served with cabbage, fresh bread, which Mary bakes in batches throughout the day, a roast chicken or 2 which she sells by the half, pickled eggs in a jar on the counter which sell at 2 cents each, apple pie when apples are in season, which they are right now in late August, coffee kept hot on the back of the stove all day, tea for the more refined customers. The food is plain, the food is also good. Mary is a careful cook, and the meat is fresh, and the bread is fresh, and the customers come back again and again because they know what they will get and they like it. The tap room in the evening is what the boatmen come here for. After a long day on the canal, after 12 or 14 hours of work, they want food and drink and the company of other men who have spent the day doing similar work. They sit at the bar, they sit at the tables, they tell each other stories, they argue about the canal companies, which are always the topic of complaint, because the rates the canal companies charge for tolls are always too high, and the maintenance the canal companies do is always too slow, and the rules the canal companies impose are always too strict, and these are matters that any boatman can hold forth on for an hour or more if you give him the chance. They argue about politics, which in this period means they argue about Whigs and Democrats and tariffs and slavery, and the arguments can become heated, although Daniel has a rule about politics in the tap room, which is that customers can have opinions but cannot raise their voices, and customers who raise their voices are asked to take their opinions outside. The rule is enforced, gently when possible, less gently when necessary. Daniel is not a large man, but he has a way of putting his hand on the bar and looking at a customer that ends most arguments before they require physical intervention. The fiddler arrives around 7. His name is Tom Mahoney, and he is 52 years old, and he has been playing the fiddle in this taproom for 15 years. He is paid, by Daniel, 50 cents a night plus drinks plus tips from the customers. The customers tip generously, because a good fiddler is one of the things that makes a tavern worth coming to, and a bad fiddler is one of the things that makes a tavern fail. Tom Mahoney is a good fiddler. He plays the standards, the old Irish tunes from the country he left as a young man, the canal songs that have developed over the past 2 decades, the popular tunes from the cities that filter their way up the canal in the form of sheet music sold by travelling peddlers. He plays for 3 hours. The customers listen, and they sing along when the songs are familiar, and a few of them dance occasionally if the spirit moves them, and the room becomes warm with the human heat of 40 or 50 men in close quarters making music together. This is one of the great pleasures of the canal era. The tap room in the evening with the fiddler playing. I want to ask you something genuinely. When was the last time you spent an evening in a room full of other people making music together, not listening to recorded music, not watching a performance, singing along or dancing, or simply sitting with a glass in your hand while someone played and other people listened? It is, I think, one of the things we have most fully lost in our time, although it has been making a comeback in certain corners. The people in this tap room in 1843 are doing something that human beings have done for as long as there have been human beings. They are gathering at the end of the day to share food and drink and music. They are not doing it because anyone has told them to. They are doing it because it is what people do, and because the day has been long, and because they need it. We need it too. We have, in 1,000 small ways, made it harder for ourselves to have it. I notice this sometimes. I do not always know what to do about it. The dining room next door is more sedate. The dining room is for travellers who do not want the noise of the tap room, for the rare lady passenger who is staying overnight on her way somewhere, for the local respectable families who occasionally come for Sunday dinner. The dining room has a tablecloth on each table, real cloth napkins, china plates instead of the tin ones used in the tap room. Mary serves the dining room herself, with help from Lizzie when the dining room is busy. The food is the same food that is served in the tap room, but it is served with more care, on better plates, with proper silverware. The price is slightly higher. The clientele is slightly different. Both the dining room and the tap room are necessary parts of the establishment. Daniel and Mary have been running this calibration for 2 decades. They know how to do it. Now let me talk about commerce more broadly, because the tavern is one node in a larger web, and the larger web is what made canal towns the economic centres they were. In a town this size, on the canal in 1843, you have, in addition to the tavern, a dry goods store, a feed store, a chandlery that sells supplies specifically for boats, a blacksmith, a cooper, a livery stable, a small bank, a doctor, a lawyer, a Methodist church, a Catholic church, which serves the considerable Irish immigrant population, a Presbyterian church, a small school, a post office, a newspaper office, a barber, a milliner who sells women's hats and accessories, a shoemaker, a tailor, 2 warehouses, a small mill that processes grain coming in from local farms, and a slaughterhouse on the edge of town that handles livestock for both local consumption and shipping. That is, for a town of 800 people, an extraordinarily complete commercial ecosystem. It is more complete than most towns of comparable size today. It is more complete than most towns of comparable size were in the period before the canal. The canal has made it possible. The canal has connected this town to the rest of the country in a way that allows specialised businesses to find the customer base they need. The dry goods store is the closest thing to a department store that this town possesses. It is run, as I mentioned earlier, by Mr. Thompson, and it sells almost everything that is not specifically the province of one of the other shops. Cloth, by the bolt, in dozens of varieties. Thread and needles and buttons and pins, sugar and salt and coffee and tea and spices, lamp oil, candles, dishes and pots and pans, tools, the smaller ones at least. Books, a small selection, mostly Bibles and primers and the McGuffey readers, but with a few novels in stock that turn over slowly. Newspapers from Albany and New York, 3 days behind. Mail, since the post office is in the corner of the store. Notions of every description, from sewing kits to pencils to small toys for children. The store smells of all of this together, of cloth and tobacco and coffee and lamp oil, and the particular smell of paper that books and newspapers produce, and it is one of the most pleasant smells in the town. Hannah comes here once a week to buy what the family needs. The boatmen come here in passing, when their boats stop at the wharf, to pick up small things they have run out of. The women of the town come here to gossip and to look at the new bolts of cloth that have just come in from New York, and to buy the small things that make their households work. The store is, in a real sense, a community centre. The chandlery is a different kind of place. It serves boats and only boats, rope, in many sizes hanging in coils from the ceiling, tar in barrels for sealing the seams of the boats, pitch similarly, replacement boards of various sizes for repairing damaged hulls, iron fittings of every description, lanterns and lamp oil and wicks, whistles, the brass ones that boats use for signalling, mule harnesses and mule shoes, and the curry combs and brushes that mule drivers use, feed bags, watering buckets. The chandlery is run by an old man named Mr. Wickham, who used to be a boat captain himself before he retired and bought the chandlery from the previous owner. Mr. Wickham knows everything there is to know about boats. He talks to his customers as a peer, not as a salesman. If a captain comes in with a problem, Mr. Wickham will spend half an hour discussing it before recommending what to buy, and the recommendation will often be that the captain does not need to buy something new at all, that what is broken can be fixed with what the captain already has. This is bad business in a sense, but Mr. Wickham has been running this store for 15 years and his customers come back to him precisely because of this kind of advice, and the store is reliably profitable, and Mr. Wickham is satisfied with his life in a way that I think we should all aspire to. The blacksmith, who's Hannah's brother, whose name is John, has a shop set back from Main Street in a small wooden building, with a forge inside and a yard outside where he keeps his tools and his work in progress. John shoes mules. John repairs the iron fittings on canal boats. John makes the iron banding for the lock gate replacement work that the Commission orders. John makes the small iron items that the town and the surrounding farms need, the hinges and the hooks and the latches and the door handles and the chains and the nails. John is busy all day, every day, for the entire navigation season, and busy for most of the winter as well, because the winter is when the boats are hauled up and repaired, and the repairs require ironwork. John is the kind of man who eats 6 meals a day and who sleeps deeply at night, and who is at his forge by 5:30 every morning. He's 45 years old and has been doing this work since he was 16. His arms are like the limbs of a young oak. His eyes have the particular squint of a man who's been looking into a forge fire for 30 years. He is widely considered the best blacksmith for 30 miles in any direction, and he charges accordingly, although he gives a discount to family members and to the captains who have been coming to him for years, and who he considers friends. The cooper, whose name is Mr. Boatmen, makes barrels, wheat barrels, flour barrels, salt barrels, whiskey barrels. The barrel is the principal shipping container of the Canal era. Almost everything that is shipped in barrels, because barrels are stackable and roll easily and protect their contents from weather and water and rough handling. The cooper, in a canal town, is therefore a key supplier. Mr. Boatmen employs 3 apprentices and works 10-hour days from spring through fall, producing barrels by the dozen. He has a small lumberyard behind his shop where the staves are seasoning. He has a forge of his own where he makes the iron hoops. He has a workbench where the staves are shaped and assembled, and a series of clamps and presses where the barrels are formed and bound. The work is precise. A good barrel is watertight without leaking, and stays watertight for years. A bad barrel leaks and cannot be sold. Mr. Boatmen's barrels are good, by general agreement, and he sells everything he makes. The whole commercial life of the town turns on the canal. The wheat that comes through the warehouses pays for the warehouses. The boatmen who tie up at the wharves pay for the taverns. The boats themselves pay for the chandlery and the blacksmith and the cooper. The mules pay for the livery stables and the feed store. The travellers pay for the inns. The whole structure depends on the canal continuing to run, on the freight continuing to move, on the boats continuing to come. It has been running for 18 years now, and it has been growing the whole time, and there is no reason in 1843 for anyone in this town to think that it will not keep growing. The railroads, which will eventually displace the canal, are still in their infancy. The canal era still feels permanent. The canal era is still expanding. I want to leave this section with one image, because I think it captures something about the nature of canal town commerce that I find particularly moving. It is late afternoon, the wharves are busy, a canal boat is tied up at one of the warehouses, and the dock workers are unloading barrels of flour from the cargo hold up the loading dock and into the warehouse. The barrels are being moved by hand, 2 men to a barrel for the heavy ones, 1 man for the lighter ones. The work is steady and rhythmic. Each barrel weighs roughly 200 pounds when full of flour. Each barrel represents the wheat from a particular farm, harvested by particular hands, threshed and ground and packed into this barrel by particular hands, loaded onto this boat at some town further west by particular hands, and now being carried by these particular hands into this warehouse, where it will sit for a few weeks until another boat comes to take it on toward Albany, where it will be loaded onto a sloop that will carry it down the Hudson to New York, where it will be sold to a baker or a merchant or a household, and where it will be eaten as bread by particular people in particular homes. Every barrel has a story like this, a chain of human labour that connects a farm in the Genesee Valley to a kitchen in Lower Manhattan. The chain is long. The chain is also entirely made of human beings doing physical work. There is no machinery to speak of. There are no engines. There are no automated systems. There are only people working in coordination, moving material across distance, 1 barrel at a time, 10 hours a day, 6 days a week. The whole American economy of the Canal era runs on this kind of labour. It is the foundation. It is the substance. It is the thing we have, in our time of automation and machinery and global supply chains, mostly forgotten how to see. I want to spend this whole section with the women, because the women's experience of the Canal era has been particularly under-recorded, and because the women were, by any measure, half the story. We have already met some of them. Hannah, the lock tender's wife, who keeps the household and the ledger. Margaret, the boat captain's wife, who keeps her family of 6 alive in 12 square feet of cabin, Mary, the tavern keeper's wife, who runs the kitchen and the upstairs rooms, Mrs. Halloran, the warehouse keeper's wife, who has the bread in the oven by 5 in the morning, Mrs. Thompson, who runs the post office in the corner of her husband's dry goods store. There are many more I have not yet mentioned, and I want to mention some of them now, because each kind of woman in this town had her own particular life and her own particular labour, and the texture of those lives is one of the things most worth recovering from this era. There is first the doctor's wife. Her name is Mrs. Whitfield, and she's 42 years old, and she's one of the most influential women in this town in ways that are not always recognised. She's the doctor's wife, which means she has access to medical knowledge that no other woman in the town possesses except by virtue of her own observations and her own reading. She's also, in practice, the doctor's nurse and his record keeper and his apothecary's assistant. The doctor sees patients in his office above the dry goods store, but he also makes house calls, and when he is on house calls, Mrs. Whitfield often sees patients herself in the office, handling minor cases that do not require the doctor's full attention, dispensing medicines from the cabinet that she keeps locked, and referring more serious cases for the doctor's return. She has done this for 20 years. She knows, by this point, almost as much practical medicine as her husband does, although she does not have the formal credential and would not be permitted to practice on her own under any circumstances. The arrangement works. The patients accept it. The doctor is grateful for it. Mrs. Whitfield is, in any meaningful sense, half of a medical practice, although the historical record will list only her husband. There is the widow who runs the boarding house. Her name is Mrs. Sutton, and she is 56 years old, and her husband died 10 years ago when a boat he was working on capsized in a storm, and he was struck by falling cargo. He did not drown. He died from the injury. She was left with 4 children, all of whom were old enough at the time of his death that they were able to help support the household, although the household was entirely dependent on what she could earn. She turned the family home into a boarding house, the year after her husband died, with the help of her oldest son, who built additional rooms on the back of the house. She has been running it ever since. She has space for 12 boarders at a time. Most of her boarders are unmarried men who work in the town, the clerks and the apprentices and the warehouse men and the schoolmaster and the new doctor's assistant who arrived last year. Some of her boarders are travellers passing through who need a room for a few days. The boarding house is, by Canal town standards, respectable. Mrs. Sutton has rules, the way the boarding houses we discussed in earlier eras had rules. No drinking on the premises, no women visitors after 6 in the evening, lights out by 10, breakfast at 7, dinner at noon, supper at 6, laundry done weekly by the laundress she employs. The rules are enforced. The boarders comply, mostly because Mrs. Sutton's establishment is one of the cleaner and quieter options in town, and because Mrs. Sutton's rates are reasonable, and because Mrs. Sutton herself is well liked despite her firmness. She is, in her own way, a small businesswoman, and she has been running this small business successfully for a decade. She is solvent, she is independent, she's raising her own grandchildren now, since her oldest daughter died in childbirth and the children came to live with her. She is, in short, doing it. She's doing it by herself, the way her husband and she used to do it together, only more so, and with the particular weight of having had to learn the running of a business after 50 years of having let her husband handle the money. There is the laundress. Her name is Mrs. Green, and she's 48, and she's one of the very few black residents of this town in this period. She came north from Maryland 12 years ago. She does not talk about how. She does not talk about why. The town knows, in the way small towns know things without being told, that she came up the canal as a passenger on a boat, travelling with people who paid for her passage, and that she has been here ever since. She's set up a laundry business, washing clothes for households that can afford to pay for the service, and she does most of the laundry for Mrs. Sutton's boarding house, and for the Black Horse, and for several of the more comfortable households in town. She does the laundry in a yard behind her small house, with 3 large iron kettles set over wood fires, and washing boards, and clotheslines that run the length of the yard. The washing is hard work. The boiling water is hot. The lye soap is harsh on the hands. The wringing of the wet clothes requires considerable strength. Mrs. Green does this work 6 days a week, with one assistant, a younger woman named Sarah whom she has trained. Mrs. Green earns, by the standards of the town, a respectable income. She lives modestly. She saves. She is widely respected in a quiet way by the women of the town for whom she works, although she's not invited into their parlours and would not expect to be. The town's race relations are not unlike those of most northern canal towns of this period, which is to say there is some tolerance, some integration in the marketplace and on the street, and considerable separation in matters of social life and politics. Mrs. Green knows where she stands. She makes her living. She lives her life. She has a small group of friends who come to her house on Sunday afternoons, mostly women who came north as she did, and who provide the kind of community that a person needs to have. She is, in her own way, one of the strongest people in this town. There is the schoolmistress. Her name is Miss Martin, and she's 28 years old, and she has been the schoolmistress of this town for 6 years. She came here from Geneva, New York, where she attended a normal school for 2 years after finishing her own schooling. She's unmarried. She is, in the language of the period, a respectable young woman of education and refinement. She lives in a small room she rents from a family on the edge of town. She teaches the school's 25 students, ranging in age from 6 to 14, in a single-room schoolhouse, with all the grades together, doing different work at the same time, with Miss Martin moving from group to group throughout the day. She teaches reading, writing, arithmetic, geography, history, and a small amount of natural science. She is paid $140 a year, which is the standard rate for a schoolmistress in upstate New York in this period. The school year runs from October through May, with a long summer break that allows the children to help on their families' farms, or in the case of Canal Town children, to help with whatever family business demands attention in the warm months. Miss Martin uses her summers to travel to Geneva to visit her mother and to read and to plan the next year's lessons. She's not married, and she has no immediate prospects of marriage, and she's begun to suspect in her late 20s that she may not marry, and she's been quietly deciding what to do about that suspicion. She likes her work. She likes this town. She has begun to think about whether she could, in time, build a life here that would be substantively her own. She's been corresponding with a woman she met at the normal school, a friend named Anna, who is now teaching in a town 50 miles east of here, and the two of them have begun to discuss very carefully in the kind of language that the period required, the possibility of eventually setting up a household together. Miss Martin does not know whether this will come to pass. She is hopeful. She also does not know whether she would be permitted to remain a schoolmistress if she set up such a household, since the commission that oversees the school has views about the marital status of its teachers, and the views are not always consistent. She is thinking, she is reading, she is teaching, she is, in her own quiet way, planning a life. There is Mrs. Halloran's daughter, Anna Halloran, who is 16, and who is at the age where her mother is starting to think about her future, and where Anna herself is starting to think about her future, and where the futures the two of them are imagining are not always the same future. Anna wants to go to a normal school like Miss Martin did, and become a schoolmistress herself. Anna has read every book in the small school library. Anna writes long letters to her cousin in Albany about books and ideas. Anna's mother thinks Anna should marry, because Anna is 16, and pretty, and the right kind of young man would set Anna up for a comfortable life. The argument between Anna and her mother is not loud, but it is constant. Anna's father has not yet weighed in. Anna's father, a busy man, is letting his wife handle this, although he is privately on Anna's side, having always been impressed by his daughter's mind. The negotiation continues. Anna may yet go to the normal school. Anna may yet marry the right kind of young man. Anna may yet do both, although the period does not make the both very easy. Anna is, in her own way, wrestling with the same questions that women in every era have wrestled with, and she has the particular advantage of being in a town and in a family that, while imperfect, is allowing her to wrestle with them rather than simply telling her what to do. I want to take a moment to note something about all of these women. None of them, in any meaningful sense, would be considered famous by the standards of historical recognition. They will not appear in textbooks. They will not be the subject of biographies. They will not be carved into monuments. They are, by the metrics that history typically uses, ordinary. They are also, by the metrics I have come to think more important, doing extraordinary work. They are running businesses. They are practicing medicine. They are running boarding houses and washing clothes and teaching children and keeping books and managing the small enterprises that make the town function. They are doing this work without recognition, without legal protection in many cases, without the formal credentials that men in similar positions would have, and without the wages that men in similar positions would receive. They are doing it anyway. The town runs because they do. Here is something I want to say plainly. The history of the American Canal era has been written, mostly, as the history of the canals themselves and of the men who built them and ran them. The history of the women who lived along the canals, who made the boats into homes, who turned the tavern kitchens into reliable sources of food for thousands of travellers, who washed the clothes and taught the children and tended the sick and kept the records and ran the boarding houses and dispensed the medicines that history is largely uncollected. We have fragments. We have the occasional diary. We have a few letters. We have the lists of names in the census records, with their occupations, when their occupations were recorded, which was not always. We have, in short, the bones of the story, but not the story itself. The story has to be reconstructed at this distance from the bones. What I keep coming back to when I sit with these women in my mind is the smallness of what they ask for. They are not asking for fame. They are not asking mostly for any kind of dramatic recognition. They are asking, when they ask anything, for the work to be remembered, for the children they raised to know what they did, for the recipes to be passed down, for the daily wisdoms to be carried forward, for the laundry that Mrs. Green boiled on a Tuesday morning in 1843 to be remembered as a kind of work that mattered, for the medicines that Mrs. Whitfield dispensed from her locked cabinet to be remembered as a kind of practice, for the small businesses, the small homes, the small lives, the small towns, to be remembered as having been real and worth taking seriously. That is what they ask for, not always in words, often in the cumulative testimony of how they live their days. They ask, by living, that the living be acknowledged. This is, in a small way, what tonight has been. The acknowledging, the remembering, the careful holding of the small things, the recognition that the work was real, and the people who did it were real, and the lives they lived were full of more than the highlights that have made it into the histories. The women of this town, on this Tuesday in August in 1843, are doing the work. They are doing it well. They are doing it without recognition. They will, in their old age, look back on these years with a complicated feeling that will include, somewhere in it, a quiet pride in the fact that they were there, that they did their part, that the families came through, that the town came through, that whatever came next was at least partly the result of women like them doing what they did. The afternoon turns toward evening. Hannah at the lockhouse begins to think about supper. Margaret on the boat, which has tied up 40 miles east now, does the same. Mary at the Black Horse is already cooking the evening stew. Mrs. Sutton at the boarding house is supervising Lizzie's setting of the dinner table. Mrs. Green at her laundry yard is taking the last batch of sheets off the line. Miss Martin in her rented room is grading papers. Anna Halloran is reading a book by the window in her father's office, where she has slipped away to escape her mother's latest matrimonial speculation. The women, scattered across the town doing the work that holds the town together, are turning their attention toward the evening. The day is winding down. The day is also, in countless small ways across countless quiet rooms and yards and kitchens, being completed. The women will close out the day the way they always do. The town will eat, the town will sleep, the town will tomorrow be ready to do it all again, because the women will have made sure it can be. I want to spend this section with the children of the Canal era, because I think the children's experience of this world is one of the most particular and most worth understanding, and because the children are the future of this story in a way that the adults are not. The adults will live out their lives in this canal world. The children will inherit something else. Let me start with the boat children. The children, like Patrick and Bridget and Thomas and Kate Murphy, who grow up on canal boats. There were thousands of them, maybe tens of thousands, across the canal era as a whole. Boat children were a particular type of American child, and they had a particular type of childhood, and that childhood is worth describing in some detail. A boat child, born on a boat, raised on a boat, grew up with the canal as the central fact of their life in a way that no land-based child possibly could. The boat was their home, the cabin was their bedroom, the deck was their playground, the water was their constant companion, the mules were their pets, in some loose sense, although they were also working animals and the relationship was not simple. The towpath was their walking road, when they were old enough to walk on it. The other boats they passed were their familiar landmarks. The captains and the drivers of the other boats were the recurring characters of their social life. They knew by the time they were 8 or 9 every lock between Buffalo and Albany. They knew the landmarks of the canal the way other children knew the landmarks of the streets around their homes. They had walked, in pieces, the entire towpath of the Erie Canal multiple times by the time they were 10. The boat children were not mostly formally educated. The schoolmistresses we just discussed taught the town children. The boat children, who were not in any one town long enough to attend a regular school, were taught by their mothers, when their mothers had time and inclination to teach them, and by themselves, when they had time and inclination to teach themselves. The McGuffey readers travelled with most boats. The Bibles travelled with all of them. A boat child who learned to read learned because someone in the family was willing to sit with the child and teach the letters, and then teach the words, and then, eventually, teach the sentences. Some boat children became excellent readers this way, especially the ones whose mothers had themselves been educated, and who valued education, and who insisted on it as a daily discipline. Other boat children remained largely illiterate, especially the ones whose mothers had not been educated themselves and who could not teach what they did not know. The variation was wide. The system was informal. The results, in the aggregate, were that boat children had lower literacy rates than town children of the same period. But the gap was not as wide as you might expect, because the boat mothers who did teach taught their children with the focused attention that one-on-one instruction allows, and the children who learned often learned well. Patrick Murphy can read fluently. He has read every book his mother brought on board. He has read the Bible cover to cover twice, although he understood very little of it the first time and only somewhat more the second. He has read the McGuffey readers through the 6th level, which is the highest level the family possesses. He has read a copy of Robinson Crusoe that his mother bought from a peddler 2 years ago, and that has been the most popular book on the boat ever since, with all 4 children having read it or had it read to them at some point. He has read, more recently, a copy of David Copperfield that his uncle in Albany sent him for his last birthday, and which he is making his way through slowly, struggling with the long sentences but pushing through because he has decided he wants to be the kind of man who reads books like this. Patrick is 14. He does not know yet what he wants to do with his life. He is leaning towards staying on the canal and eventually running his own boat, because that is what he knows, and because his father has begun discussing the possibility with him in serious terms. He is also entertaining, in private, the possibility of going to Albany and apprenticing himself to a printing shop, and learning a trade that involves words. He has not told anyone about this idea. He is not sure yet whether it is a real plan, or whether it is a fantasy. He will figure it out in time. The advantage of 14 is that you have time. Bridget, who is 11, is the great reader of the family. Bridget reads the way some children eat, with a constant, urgent appetite that nothing quite satisfies. Bridget has read everything Patrick has read and more, because Bridget seeks out books wherever she can find them, and the canal towns the family stops in have small libraries in some cases, and bookstores in some cases, and friendly shopkeepers in some cases, who will let a young girl sit in a corner of the store and read for an hour while her mother does the provisioning. Bridget has read Shakespeare in this manner. Bridget has read Sir Walter Scott. Bridget has read poetry by Wordsworth and Byron and Felicia Hemans. Bridget has, in short, given herself an education that her mother could not have given her, by sheer force of will and the kindness of the occasional adult who recognises a serious reader when they see one. Bridget is going to be someone in time. Her mother knows this. Her father knows this. Her parents have begun to discuss quietly the possibility of sending Bridget to live with Margaret's sister in Connecticut for a few years, so that she can attend a proper school. The discussion has not been had with Bridget yet. Bridget would, if asked, agree in an instant. Bridget is hungry for the kind of education that the boat cannot provide, and she knows it. And she's patient because she trusts her parents to make the right decision in time, but she is not infinitely patient. The decision is going to have to be made. Thomas, who is 8, is the boat naturalist. He cares about reading less than his older siblings do, and reads adequately but without enthusiasm, and is more interested in the world outside the cabin than in the world inside books. Thomas can name every kind of bird that lives along the canal. Thomas knows the difference between a bullfrog and a green frog and a leopard frog. Thomas can tell you at a glance what kind of fish is jumping in the canal at any given moment. Thomas spends his days on deck, watching the water and the banks and the sky, and he has accumulated, by the age of 8, a working knowledge of the canal's natural environment that exceeds that of most adults. Thomas is going to be either a naturalist or a hunter or a farmer, depending on how things shake out, but it is clear already that his life is going to be about being outside. His parents accept this. They make sure he is outside as much as the boat's safety allows. They have stopped trying to keep him in the cabin during reading time, which never worked anyway, and they have arranged for him to spend an hour each evening with his father on deck, learning the practical skills of canal navigation, which Thomas takes to with pleasure. Kate, who is 5, is the family's project. Kate is being taught to read by her mother, in short daily sessions that fit between the other tasks of the day. Kate is being taught to count by her father, who tests her on numbers as the boat moves down the canal. Kate is being taught practical kitchen skills by her mother and Bridget together, who have her chopping vegetables and stirring pots and washing dishes already. Although the dishes are sometimes broken, and the chopping is sometimes alarming and the stirring sometimes results in soup ending up on the floor, Kate is delightful. Kate is also, by the standards of the period, a normal 5-year-old, which is to say she is sometimes difficult, sometimes whiny, sometimes entirely unreasonable about things that an adult would consider to be of no consequence. Her parents handle her with the tired patience of people who have been raising children for 15 years and who know that this stage will pass. It does pass. It always does. Kate, in 5 more years, will be the kind of older child that Bridget is now. The future of children is, with some exceptions, predictable, even when the present of children is exhausting. The boat children, taken together, are an interesting class of people. They have a worldliness that town children do not. They have seen more of the country, by the time they are 10, than most adults of their period have seen in a lifetime. They have met more different kinds of people. They have observed more different kinds of work being done. They have, in the formal sense, less education than their town counterparts, but in the experiential sense they have far more. They tend to be, as adults, exceptionally adaptable. They tend to settle when they settle in the cities, because they are comfortable with motion and crowds and unfamiliar surroundings in a way that more sheltered children are not. They tend to be, in their adult careers, generalists rather than specialists, because they grew up doing whatever needed to be done and not specialising in any one thing. The Canal era produced, over its 40-year peak, a particular American type, the boat child grown up, who showed up later in the cities and on the western frontier, and in the new industries that were emerging in the second half of the 19th century. The boat children were everywhere by 1870. They had, by then, dispersed across the country. The boats they had grown up on were mostly gone. The canals they had worked were mostly fading into the rural past. But the boat children themselves were active in American life, doing the work of their adult years, carrying with them the skills and the temperaments that growing up on the water had given them. Now let me turn to the town children, because their experience of canal life is also worth describing, even though it is more familiar to us in its outlines. The town children of this town, Samuel and Hannah's children among them, grow up in a town whose life is structured around the canal, but who do not themselves work on the canal in the way that the boat children do. They go to school, they help with the family's chores, they play in the streets and in the fields and along the banks of the canal in the warm months. They go fishing, they swim, the boys mostly, in the canal in the summer, in spite of their mother's warnings about leeches and currents and unspecified dangers. They watch the boats, they wave to the boatmen, they run errands. They pick up small jobs in the businesses of the town as they grow older, sweeping out the warehouses for a few cents a week, helping the blacksmith with the bellows, carrying small parcels from the dry goods store to customers' houses for tips. They earn their first money this way, they learn the value of money this way. By the time they are 12, most of them have small savings hidden in jars or boxes or under loose floorboards, and they have begun to plan, in the small ways that 12-year-olds plan, what they will do with the money when they have enough. Samuel and Hannah's older son, whose name is Henry, is 16, and he is at the age where his future is being actively negotiated. Henry has been an indifferent student, smart enough but not particularly interested in school, and he has been, since the age of 10, increasingly interested in whatever his Uncle John the blacksmith is doing. Henry has been spending more and more time in the blacksmith shop, learning the trade by watching and helping, and Uncle John, who has no children of his own and who has come to view Henry as a kind of son, has begun to talk seriously about taking Henry on as a formal apprentice. The arrangement would be a 4-year apprenticeship during which Henry would live in his uncle's house, work at the forge, and learn the trade. At the end of the 4 years, Henry would be a journeyman blacksmith, capable of setting up his own shop or of working as an employed smith in someone else's shop. The arrangement is a good one for Henry. It is a good one for John. It is a good one for the family, which would not have to support Henry through the apprenticeship years, since John would house and feed him in exchange for the labour. Hannah is in favour. Samuel is in favour. Henry himself is in favour. The matter is essentially settled, although the formal arrangements have not yet been made. Henry will likely move to his uncle's house in the fall after the navigation season ends, and his apprenticeship will begin then. Samuel and Hannah's daughter, whose name is Rebecca, is 13, and she is at a different stage of negotiation. Rebecca is a strong student. She reads well. She does arithmetic with confidence. She is, in Miss Martin's professional assessment, the kind of student who would do well in further schooling if further schooling were possible. The question, for Rebecca's parents, is whether further schooling is possible and whether they should pursue it. The cost of sending Rebecca to a normal school in Geneva or Albany would be considerable. The family would have to pay for tuition, for board, for clothing, for the small expenses of a girl living away from home for the first time. The total cost over 2 years would be perhaps $200. The family does not have $200. The family could, however, raise $200, with effort, by selling some property and saving aggressively for 2 years. The question is whether to do it. The answer, in Hannah's mind, is yes. The answer, in Samuel's mind, is also yes, although he is more hesitant about it than Hannah is, and would not have arrived at yes without her urging. The plan is taking shape. Rebecca, when the schooling begins, will be 15, which is the right age for a normal school. She will go. She will become, in time, a schoolmistress like Miss Martin, who has been her teacher and her model. She will make a life for herself in a way that her mother could not have imagined when Hannah was Rebecca's age. The family will have launched, with the careful saving and the small sacrifice and the willingness to invest in a daughter, the next generation. This is what families do, when they can. This is what Samuel and Hannah are doing. Samuel and Hannah's youngest son, whose name is Edward, is 8, and he is too young yet to be the subject of serious negotiation about his future. Edward is in school. Edward is doing the small chores his mother gives him. Edward is, like all 8-year-olds, more interested in playing with his friends than in any consideration of what he will be when he grows up. He has a best friend, a boy named James who lives 3 houses down, and the two of them spend most of their free time together, fishing in the canal, climbing the trees on the edge of town, building small forts in the brush along the heel path, conducting the small adventures that boys conduct everywhere when they are 8. Edward is happy. Edward will, in time, become whatever he becomes. His parents are not worrying about him yet. I want to ask you something. When you think about what your parents made possible for you, what do you think of? The decisions they made, the sacrifices they made, the doors they opened that they did not themselves walk through, the careful saving that allowed you to do the thing they could not have done, the encouragement, sometimes spoken and sometimes simply present in the way they treated you, that gave you permission to imagine a different life. Most of us have some version of this in our pasts, even when our relationships with our parents have been complicated, even when there were also painful things, even when not everything they did was what we needed. There is, in most lives, some version of the small inheritance that makes the next chapter possible. Samuel and Hannah are giving Rebecca that inheritance now. Hannah's parents gave her something similar a generation ago, when they paid for her 2 years at the academy in Massachusetts that taught her to read and write fluently, and that made it possible for her eventually to keep the lock tender's books for her husband. The inheritance moves down the generations. Each generation gives what it can. Each generation receives what was given. The transmission is imperfect, and sometimes it breaks, and sometimes it accelerates, but in most families across most periods, there is some version of it happening, and it is, I think, one of the more beautiful things human beings do. The afternoon, in the town, is the time of children at their most visible. School is out for the summer. The children are everywhere, on the streets, along the canal, in the fields behind the town, in the small grove of trees that the children call the woods, although it is only 10 acres, in the yards of their houses, in and out of the businesses where their parents work. The town tolerates their presence with the easy familiarity of a small community in which everyone knows everyone. The boatmen passing through wave to them. The shopkeepers give them small bits of candy or fruit. The widows of the town occasionally call them over to send them on small errands in exchange for pennies. The town raises its children in the way that small towns have always raised children, with the casual collective oversight of many adults, with the freedom of unstructured time, with the small risks that come with being allowed to roam. The children of this town are, by modern standards, extraordinarily free. They are, by the standards of their period, ordinary. They are, in their own experience, simply children doing what children do. They will remember this town when they are old, with a particular affection that comes from having been allowed to be children in it. Some of them will leave it and never come back. Some of them will stay. Some of them will leave and return decades later for a visit and find it changed almost beyond recognition. But the canal, and the towpath, and the stone walls of the lock, and the small streets of the downtown will be in their memories forever, the way the geography of childhood is always in the memories of the people who lived through it. The day is ending now. I want you to picture the town as the light goes long. The sun has dropped below the level of the trees on the western edge of the town. The canal water, which has been bright and shifting all day, is now darker, the surface still and almost glassy in the evening calm. The first lamps are being lit in the windows of the houses. The smell of cooking is coming out of every chimney. The boatmen who have tied up for the night are eating their suppers, some on the decks of their boats, some in the taverns, some in the homes of friends or family in the town. The mules have been led to the stables. The mule drivers have washed up at the troughs and are walking toward whatever supper they have been promised. The day is finishing. In Hannah's kitchen, supper is on the table. Samuel has come in from the lock, which has been turned over to Joseph for the evening shift, and he's washing his hands in the basin Hannah keeps by the back door. The children are at the table, all 4 of them. Since Patrick is back from his uncle's shop and Henry is back from his own day's work and Rebecca and Edward have been called in from their wandering. The supper is what supper usually is. A stew with potatoes and carrots and salt pork. Bread that Hannah baked this afternoon. Butter, which Hannah churned from the morning's cream. A pitcher of milk for the children. Coffee for Samuel and Hannah. A small bowl of pickled cucumbers from the jar on the shelf. A piece of pie made with apples from the tree in the backyard, which Hannah baked while supper was simmering and which is for after. The family eats together. The children talk, in the loose way that children talk about their days. Henry has been at his uncle's shop. He's been allowed to do some work on a small piece of harness that needed repair. He's been told by his uncle that he is getting better, which from his uncle is the highest possible praise. Rebecca has been reading a book she borrowed from Miss Martin, who has been encouraging Rebecca's reading all summer in the hope of preparing her for the normal school that the family is planning to send her to. Edward has been fishing with James and has caught 2 perch, which were too small to keep, but which he describes in great detail anyway. Patrick says less, because he has been working at the lock with his father all afternoon, and has nothing to report that his father does not already know. Hannah listens. Samuel listens. They occasionally ask questions. They mostly let the children fill the air with their reports of the day, because this is the time of day when the children get to talk and they enjoy it, and the parents enjoy hearing it. After supper, the dishes are washed. Hannah does the washing, Rebecca dries. Edward, who is supposed to be helping, is reading instead, with a book propped open on the table next to him while he holds a dish towel at a lazy angle that does not actually accomplish any drying. Hannah notices but does not say anything. Edward is 8. He is reading. The drying can wait. The dishes get done. The family moves to the front room. The lamp on the table is lit. The fire in the fireplace, which has been kept low all day in the warm weather, is built up slightly because the evening is cool. Samuel sits in his chair by the fire with his pipe. Hannah sits in her chair across from him with her sewing basket on her lap. The children dispose themselves around the room. Patrick is reading David Copperfield. Slowly, his finger sometimes following the lines on the page. Henry is sharpening a knife on the small whetstone he keeps for that purpose, the soft scraping sound providing a kind of background rhythm to the room. Rebecca is reading her own book, the one Miss Martin lent her. Edward is on the floor in front of the fire building something with a set of small wooden blocks his father made him last winter, which he has been playing with consistently for 9 months, and which show no sign of losing their appeal. The clock on the mantel ticks. The fire pops occasionally. The lamp throws a soft yellow circle over the table. Outside, through the window, the canal is dark now, with only the faintest reflection of the lamps in the lockhouse and in the warehouse windows opposite breaking up the surface of the water. The sound of the canal, which is a constant in this house, is now the gentle nighttime version of itself, the soft current and the occasional small splash, and the very quiet sound of water against stone. Beyond the canal, the rest of the town is similarly settling. The taverns are still active, but their noise is muffled by distance. The streets are mostly empty. The night is starting. Hannah is mending. The basket beside her contains the week's accumulation of small repairs, a pair of Edward's pants that he has torn at the knee, one of Samuel's socks with a hole in the toe, a petticoat of Rebecca's that needs a new hem, a handkerchief of Hannah's own with a frayed edge that she has not gotten around to repairing. The mending is the quiet work of the evening. She does it almost without looking, her hands moving in the small precise motions that she's been making for 30 years. She can mend and listen to the children and watch the fire and think her own thoughts all at the same time. She's doing all of it now. The pants are getting their patch. The children are reading. The fire is burning. She's thinking about Rebecca and the normal school, about whether the timing will work out, about whether the money will be saved in time, about whether they should plan to send her in the autumn of next year or the year after. She's thinking about whether she should write to her sister-in-law in Geneva, who knows the people at the school there, to ask about possible board for Rebecca during the school year. She's thinking, in short, about the future, about the careful arrangements that will allow this small family to do for the next generation what was done for her. Samuel is smoking. He smokes a pipe in the evenings, a clay pipe with a long stem packed with tobacco that he buys from the dry goods store. The smoke rises in a thin curl toward the ceiling, where it drifts and fades. He watches the fire. He thinks about the day. He thinks about the boats that came through. He thinks about the small repair that one of the upper gates needs, which he's been putting off for a week and which he should attend to tomorrow if he can find an hour. He thinks about Henry and the apprenticeship, and about what kind of man Henry will be when he is John's age, and about whether Henry will be happy. He thinks briefly about his own father, who died when Samuel was 12, and whom Samuel still misses sometimes, in the way that you miss a parent for the rest of your life, even when the loss is far in the past. He thinks about Hannah. He looks at her, sitting across from him with her mending in her lap and the lamplight on her hair, which has more grey in it than it did when they married. He thinks about how much of his life she has been the central fact of, and how he cannot now imagine a version of his life that does not have her in it. He does not say any of this. He smokes his pipe. He looks at the fire. The radio. Wait, there is no radio. The house is quiet in the way that 19th century houses were quiet, which is to say that the ambient sound is the ambient sound of the world itself. The fire, the clock, the breathing of 5 other people in the room, the occasional sound of someone shifting in a chair, the very faint sound of the canal outside. There is no music. There is no broadcast. There is no entertainment that has been brought into the house by any means other than the people in the house themselves. If they want music, someone would have to make music, and although Hannah occasionally sings while she works, and although the children sometimes sing the songs they have learned at school, no one is singing tonight. The room is held together by the presence of its occupants and the small sounds of their evening activities. I want to ask you something. When was the last time you spent an evening with your family, or with the people you live with, or by yourself, with no entertainment turned on? No music, no television, no phone open in your hand, just the presence of the people in the room, doing whatever they were doing, with the ambient sound of the world being the only sound. It is, I think, one of the harder things to arrange in modern life, and it is also one of the things that, when arranged, has a particular quality that I have come to value. The quality of attention, the quality of presence, the willingness to simply be in the room without filling it with content. The people in this house in 1843 did not have to arrange this. It was their default. They had no other option. We have, I think, given up something for the sake of all the options, and I am not proposing we go back, because the options are wonderful and I would not want to live without them. I am simply noticing that when we have a quiet evening of our own occasionally on purpose, we are recovering something that used to be the basic shape of every evening, and that the recovery feels, when we have it, like coming home to something we had forgotten. The evening goes on. Patrick puts down David Copperfield and goes upstairs to bed. He has an early start tomorrow. Rebecca finishes her chapter and follows him a few minutes later. Edward, who is playing with his blocks, and who has not been told to go to bed, and who therefore has not gone, is told to go to bed. He protests briefly. He goes anyway. Henry stays up later than the younger children, reading something of his own now, a book about ironwork that his uncle lent him. Samuel and Hannah stay up after Henry finally goes up too. They talk quietly. They have the kind of conversation that married people have at the end of the day, about small matters, about the things that came up during the day, about the plans for tomorrow. The conversation is not intimate in any dramatic sense. It is intimate in the deeper sense, which is the easy familiarity of two people who have been talking to each other for 16 years and who do not need to perform anything for each other. Eventually the fire is banked, the lamps are extinguished. Samuel and Hannah go up to bed. The house is dark, the clock ticks. The town outside the window is dark now too, with only a few lamps still burning in the houses where someone is up late, and the watch lantern at the lock where Joseph is on duty. The night is deep, the canal is still, the day is over. I want to leave you with one thought before we move into the closing reflection of tonight's story. The day we have just walked through, this Tuesday in August in 1843, in this small canal town in upstate New York, was an ordinary day. It was not a day that anyone in the town will remember specifically, because there was nothing about it that distinguished it from any of the other days in the navigation season. The boats came through, the locks cycled, the taverns did their business, the women did their work, the children ran their errands and played their games and went to bed when they were told. The town went on. This is what most days were. Most days in most lives are like this, ordinary, unremarkable, full of small specific tasks completed in their small specific ways. This is, in the end, what life mostly is. The dramatic days are the exceptions. The ordinary days are the substance. And the substance, when you look at it carefully, is full of the things we have been describing all night. The work, the relationships, the food, the conversation, the small pleasures and small frustrations, the slow movement of seasons and years and decades, the careful business of getting through the day with whatever resources you have. The people in this town are doing all of this. They are doing it well. They're doing it without recognition. They are, in the most literal sense, building America, foot by foot, lock by lock, mile by mile of canal water, year after year, generation after generation, and then, eventually, the canal era will end. The railroads will displace the canal, the towns will shrink, the boats will be hauled up for the last time, the locks will fall into disrepair, the work will move on to other forms and other geographies. The people who lived this life will grow old and die, and what will remain will be the small things, the descendants, the objects, the recipes, the songs, the memories that get passed down for a generation or two before they fade, the towpath itself, which in some places is still walkable 180 years later, although most of the people who walk it now do not know what they are walking on. But we know, tonight. We have spent these hours with them. We have, I hope, taken them seriously in a way that history sometimes does not. We have given them a few hours of attention, in the dark, before sleep. That is what the dead can ask for, mostly, and that is what we have given them tonight. I want to take you backward in time for this section, because the canal we have been walking along all night did not always exist, and the story of how it came to exist is part of the story of the town itself, and one that deserves its own attention before we close. The Erie Canal was built between 1817 and 1825. It was conceived by Governor DeWitt Clinton of New York, who pushed it through the state legislature against considerable opposition from those who considered it impossibly ambitious, and who lived long enough to see it open and be vindicated. The canal as designed was 363 miles long, 4 feet deep, 40 feet wide, with 83 locks and 18 aqueducts. It crossed the Mohawk River. It crossed the Genesee River. It rose, over its full length, 675 feet from the Hudson at Albany to Lake Erie at Buffalo. It was the largest civil engineering project ever attempted on the North American continent at that point, and it remained so for decades after. The men who built it, almost all men, with a few women working in the camp kitchens and laundries, came from a number of places. Some were local farmers and labourers who took on canal work for the cash wages it paid. Some were freedmen, formerly enslaved people from the southern states who had made their way north and who took whatever work they could get. Some were native-born Americans of older stock, the descendants of the 18th century settlers of the Mohawk Valley. But the largest single group, and the one that came to define the work in the public imagination, were the Irish. The Irish came in increasing numbers as the project progressed. They had been arriving in America in modest numbers since the 1790s, but the canal contracts paid steady wages, 80 cents a day, sometimes $1 with extras for piecework, and the word travelled back to Ireland that there was work in New York for any man who could swing a pickaxe and was willing to live in a labour camp for months at a time. They came across the ocean on the packet ships, sleeping in steerage in conditions that would horrify any modern observer, eating ship's biscuit and salt beef for the 6-week passage, arriving in New York or Philadelphia with their few belongings in canvas bags and their families if they had families with them. They made their way upstate to the canal sites. They signed on with the contractors. They began to dig. The work was extraordinary. I want to describe it in some detail because the romance of canal travel that we have been describing all night, the boats moving at 3 miles an hour through landscapes that have been domesticated for nearly 2 centuries, has obscured what it took to make those landscapes domesticated in the first place. The canal had to be cut through whatever ground it crossed. Sometimes the ground was soft, and the cutting could be done with shovels and wheelbarrows in a relatively straightforward manner. Sometimes the ground was hard, and the cutting required pickaxes and the slow, patient labour of removing rock by hand, foot by foot, day by day, for months at a time. Sometimes the ground was solid limestone, as it was in the section near Lockport at the western end of the canal, and the cutting required black powder, drilled into the stone and detonated to fracture the rock, after which the broken stone had to be hauled away by hand and by mule cart. The Lockport section alone took more than 3 years to complete, and the workers who did it lived in temporary camps along the cut, and a number of them died, from accidents with the powder, from the falls of stone, from the diseases that swept through the camps in the warm months, from the simple grinding exhaustion of the work itself. The labour camps were rough places. They were thrown together hastily, with rough shacks for sleeping, larger structures for eating, makeshift hospitals for the inevitable injuries. The men slept 4 or 6 to a small building. The food was provided by the contractors and was substantial in quantity, because the work required substantial fuel but limited in variety. Salt pork, bread, potatoes, cabbage, coffee. The men ate the same meals with minor variations for months at a time. The contractors deducted the cost of food and lodging from the wages, and the deduction was usually substantial, leaving the men with perhaps 1/3 of their nominal wages in actual cash money at the end of any given pay period. The whiskey was provided. This is one of the details that surprises modern readers. Canal contractors of this era provided whiskey to their workers as part of the working day, distributed at intervals throughout the morning and afternoon, on the theory that whiskey kept the men working and kept their spirits up and was, in any case, expected by the workers themselves. The amount was substantial. Estimates from the period suggest that a canal labourer in the 1820s might consume 4 to 6 small drinks of whiskey over the course of a working day, distributed throughout the hours of digging. The drinks were called jiggers. The jigger boss, the man whose job was to carry the whiskey jug along the line of workers and pour the rations, was a recognised position in the camp economy. The whiskey did not, by modern medical understanding, actually help the work, and probably contributed to the accident rate, but it was the practice, and it persisted. The Irish workers were not popular with the local populations. They were Catholic in a region that was overwhelmingly Protestant. They spoke with accents that the local people found difficult to understand and easy to mock. They were poor. They were often single men in their 20s, with the energies and frustrations that single men in their 20s tend to have, and they sometimes brought those energies into the towns near the construction sites in ways that the locals found alarming. There were fights. There were accusations of drunkenness and rowdiness. There were occasional more serious incidents that the newspapers reported with considerable hostility. The Irish were, in short, the immigrant labour force that this country has always depended on and has rarely treated well, and the Canal era was an early instance of a pattern that would repeat itself with successive waves of immigration through the rest of the 19th and 20th centuries. But the Irish, in their turn, did the work. They dug the canal. They built the locks. They cleared the right-of-way through forest and farmland and rocky uplands. They worked through the summer heat and the autumn rains and continued, in many cases, into the early winter when the ground had begun to freeze and the digging became correspondingly harder. They did this for 8 years, with shifts of workers coming and going, with the work site moving westward as new sections were completed and new sections were begun. The Irishmen who worked on the canal in 1817, the first year of construction, were largely not the same Irishmen who finished the canal in 1825. There had been turnover, there had been deaths, there had been men who had saved enough wages to bring their families over from Ireland, and who had left the camps to set up small farms or shops in the country they had now decided to make their permanent home. There had been men who had drunk their wages away. There had been men who had been injured and could no longer work and who had drifted off into the towns to make do as they could. There had been, by some careful estimates, perhaps 1,000 deaths over the course of the construction, though the exact figure cannot be known because the contractors did not keep careful records of worker mortality. The dead were often buried where they died, in unmarked graves along the line of the canal, and the records of who they had been and where they had come from were lost almost immediately. I want to ask you something. When you cross a bridge, or drive on a highway, or fly into an airport, or use any of the great pieces of public infrastructure that we have inherited from previous generations, do you ever think about who built them? Not the engineers whose names are on the plans, although the engineers deserve their credit. The workers, the men and women whose hands actually did the digging and the welding and the pouring of concrete, the people who lived in temporary camps and who took the dangerous shifts and who, in many cases, died doing the work, and whose names were not recorded, and whose families were not compensated, and whose contribution has been folded into the great, anonymous mass of labour that built the country? We do not mostly think about them. We use the bridges. We do not mostly think about the bridges either, except when something goes wrong with them. The infrastructure is invisible until it fails. The people who built it are invisible always. The Irish workers who built this canal are, in a sense, the great unmentioned in the story we have been telling all night. The town we have visited exists because of the canal. The canal exists because they built it. They worked themselves out of jobs, in the most literal sense, when the canal was completed, and many of them then settled in the canal towns that grew up along the route and took whatever work they could find and raised families and became part of the population of upstate New York. Daniel O'Brien at the Black Horse, whom we met earlier in the evening, came up the canal as a young man in 1825, the year the canal opened. He was 20 years old. He had been a labourer on the construction crews for the previous 2 years. He had saved his wages carefully, which was uncommon among his peers. He had decided, when the work ended, that he wanted to stay in this part of the country and set up a business of his own. He had borrowed money from a man who had known his father in Cork. He had bought the Black Horse, then a smaller and rougher establishment than it has since become, and he had built it up over 20 years into the substantial business it is today. He is, in his own life, the trajectory of the successful Irish canal worker, the one who survived, who saved, who invested, who became a propertied member of his community. There were many like him along the canal route. There were also many who did not have his discipline or his luck and who did not end up where he ended up. The Catholic Church in this town, which I mentioned briefly earlier, exists because of the Irish presence. There were not enough Catholics in this part of New York before the canal to justify a Catholic parish. The Irish workers, settling in the towns after construction ended, brought their Catholicism with them, and the Bishop of Albany sent a priest to organise a parish in 1828, 3 years after the canal opened. The church building, a small frame structure on the edge of town, was built by the parishioners themselves over the course of 2 summers. The pews were donated by individual families. The altar was built by a carpenter who had been a canal worker and who took on the project as his contribution to the community. The first masses were celebrated by visiting priests from Albany and Buffalo, with the resident priest arriving in 1831. The church has been part of the town ever since. Mary O'Brien at the Black Horse, who lights a candle for her wayward son every Sunday, lights it at this church. I want to give the canal builders one more moment of attention before we move on, because I think it is the right thing to do at this point in the story. They were mostly young men. They were mostly far from home. They were mostly doing work that was harder than any work most modern people have ever done. They were paid wages that, while better than what they could have earned in Ireland, were not generous by American standards of the period. They lived in conditions that we would now consider unacceptable. They drank to excess by any reasonable measure, partly because the drinking was provided and partly because the drinking helped them get through the work. They fought sometimes. They were homesick often. They thought about their mothers. They wrote letters home when they could write, which was not always, and the letters were sometimes received and sometimes not, depending on the reliability of the transatlantic mail in any given month. And they built the thing. They built the canal. The canal they built carried for 40 years the freight of the largest growing economy in the world. The canal they built made New York City the financial capital of the United States, because the canal made New York the natural shipping point for everything that was produced in the interior of the country. The canal they built shaped the political and economic geography of the United States for the rest of the 19th century and beyond. Without the canal, there would have been a different America. There would have been, perhaps, no Buffalo as a major city, no Rochester, no Syracuse, no Utica, none of the canal towns whose existence depended on the waterway that the Irish workers had cut through the New York countryside with their picks and their shovels and their black powder. When you stand on the towpath in this town in 1843, 18 years after the canal opened, you are standing on ground that was prepared by them. The dirt under your feet was packed down by their feet first. The path you are walking was their path before it was yours. The water you are watching was their water, contained in the channel they carved. You are walking in their footsteps in the most literal sense possible. The town you have just spent the night in, with all its residents and all their lives, exists because they did the work, 8 years of it, in conditions most of us could not now imagine, for wages that were calibrated to keep them just above subsistence and just below the threshold of saving any meaningful capital. They did it anyway. They did it because they had come this far and they were going to make something of it. Some of them did, some of them did not. The canal was made either way. I think about them sometimes, the Irish canal workers, when I think about the long inheritance of human work that I mentioned in the reflection earlier. They are part of that inheritance. We are walking on their work. We are eating, in a long indirect sense, the bread that was made from the wheat that was carried on the canal that they built. We are living in the country that their labour made possible in the form it eventually took. We do not mostly know their names. We know almost none of them. The records do not preserve the names of canal labourers in the way that they preserve the names of governors and engineers and bankers and contractors. The men who actually swung the picks are anonymous to us, almost without exception. But they were there. They were here. Their bodies are in the soil along the canal route, in the unmarked graves where they were buried when they died on the job. Their descendants are in the towns of upstate New York, the families with Irish surnames who have been here for 6 generations now, and who do not always know that their great-great-grandfathers built the canal that made their towns possible. Their faith is in the small Catholic churches that dot this part of the state. Churches that were built by their hands and that have survived as architectural artifacts of the immigrant communities they served. Their music is in the canal songs that we still occasionally sing, the Irish melodies that became American melodies through the long process of cultural transmission. They are everywhere in the substance of this place. They are nowhere in the formal records of who built it. I want this section to be, in some small way, a marking of their presence, a mention, a holding open of the space where their names would go if we knew them, a recognition that the night we have spent in this canal town was made possible by their labour and that they deserve to be named, even if we can only name them collectively, even if the individual names have been lost. The canal builders, the Irish men who did the work, the men whose graves are unmarked and whose families dispersed and whose stories were not preserved by any system that thought their stories were worth preserving. They built it. They are owed a remembering. We have given them tonight a small one. It is the least we can do, and it is, I think, also worth doing. I want to spend a quieter section on the music of the canal, because we have mentioned it several times tonight, and because the songs are one of the few things this era left behind that you can still hear today, sung in their original form by people who know them and who pass them down. The canal era produced a particular body of music. It was not formal music, in the sense of music written by composers and published as sheet music for parlour performance, although some of it eventually was published. It was working music. It was sung by the men and the boys and occasionally the women whose lives the canal organised. It was made up as it went along in many cases, and the versions varied from boat to boat and from year to year, and a song that was sung in 1835 in one form was sung in 1845 in a slightly different form by people who were not aware that they were changing it. The songs evolved. The songs adapted. The songs lived in the way that folk music lives, which is by being sung, not by being written down. The most famous of them, the one that has survived most completely into modern memory, is the song most people now know as the Erie Canal, although the song had different names in its various versions, including Lowbridge, Everybody Down, and 15 Years on the Erie Canal. The song tells the story of a boatman and his mule, named Sal, travelling the canal between Albany and Buffalo. The chorus contains the line about Lowbridge, Everybody Down, which referred to the actual low bridges that crossed the canal at various points, and under which everyone on the cabin roof had to duck to avoid being swept off into the water. The bridges were a real hazard. The song was a real reminder. The melody is plain and easy to remember and easy to sing, the way good folk melodies are. The verses can be added to or subtracted from according to the singer's preferences and the length of time they need to fill, the way good folk songs can. There were many other songs. There was a song called The Raging Canal, which was a comic song about the supposed dangers of canal travel, and which was sung as a kind of ironic joke because the canal was in fact one of the safer modes of travel available in the period. There was a song called Hooligan's Mule, about a boatman whose mule kept refusing to walk and the various indignities the boatman suffered as a result. There was a song called Buffalo Gals, which was not originally a canal song but which was widely sung along the canal because the canal connected Buffalo to the rest of the country, and Buffalo was therefore a place that boatmen sang about. There were sentimental songs about leaving home and missing loved ones. There were drinking songs, of which there were many, because boatmen drank in taverns at the end of the day, and drinking songs were what people sang in taverns. There were religious songs, hymns mostly, sung quietly on Sunday mornings by men who'd been raised Methodist or Catholic or Presbyterian, and who carried their childhood faiths with them onto the canal, even when their adult lives had moved away from regular church attendance. The fiddler at the Black Horse, Tom Mahoney, knew most of these songs in one version or another. He knew the canal songs because he had been playing on the canal for 15 years, and the songs were what his audience wanted to hear. He knew the Irish tunes from his own childhood in Dublin. He knew some of the popular American songs of the period, the Stephen Foster songs that were beginning to spread across the country in the early 1840s, the parlour ballads that the more refined customers occasionally requested. His repertoire was not formal. He had no written music. He played from memory, and the memory was extensive, because he had been playing for 40 years by this point, and a fiddler who plays for 40 years accumulates a great many tunes. The boat children learned the songs from their parents and from the boatmen they encountered. Patrick Murphy can sing 8 or 10 canal songs from memory, in versions that he learned from his father, who learned them from his father before him. Bridget knows even more because she has paid attention to lyrics in a way that her brother has not. Kate at 5 years old can already sing the chorus of the Erie Canal, badly, in the way that 5-year-olds sing things, but with great enthusiasm. The songs are part of the family's life. They are sung on the boat in the evenings when the day's work is done. They are sung as the boat moves through the long, quiet stretches of canal. They are sung at the locks while the boat is waiting, with Patrick on the deck calling out a verse and the lock tender, if he knows the song, joining in for the chorus. The songs travelled. They travelled up and down the canal from boat to boat, from lock to lock. They travelled to the other canal systems that were built in imitation of the Erie. The Ohio canals, the Pennsylvania canals, the smaller New York lateral canals, all had their own variations on the same body of music. Boatmen who worked on multiple systems carried songs from one to another and adapted them to local conditions. By the 1850s, the songs were no longer just New York songs, they were American canal songs. They had become part of the working music of an entire economic sector that stretched across half a dozen states. And then slowly as the canals declined, the songs declined with them. The boat stopped running, the boatmen retired and died. The boys who had walked the towpaths grew up and became other things. The contexts in which the songs had been sung disappeared. By the early 20th century, the songs were endangered, in the sense that folk music is endangered when its original singers die and the contexts of its original performance disappear. They were sung by older people who remembered them, but the younger people had no occasion to learn them, and the songs were close to being lost. What saved them, in part, was the folk music collectors of the early 20th century, the academic and amateur enthusiasts who recognised that the canal songs were worth preserving, and who went out to find the people who still knew them and to record their performances. By the 1930s, when serious folk music collection was being conducted in upstate New York, under the auspices of the Federal Writers Project and other Depression-era cultural programs, the canal songs were collected from the elderly survivors who could still sing them, and the texts and melodies were transcribed and archived and made available to subsequent generations. The songs were saved. They were not saved in their living form because their living form had passed, but they were saved as archived music that could be sung again by anyone who wanted to learn them. I find this story moving in a particular way that I want to try to articulate. The canal songs were sung by people who did not consider themselves musicians and who did not consider their songs important enough to preserve. The songs were just what they sang. They were what filled the long hours of work and the evenings in the taverns and the slow afternoons on the towpath. The men who sang them did not imagine that anyone in the future would care to hear them. They did not imagine, mostly, that there would be a future in which the canals were gone, and someone would want to remember what the canals had sounded like. They sang because they wanted to sing. The songs were for them, in their moment. And yet, somehow, the songs have come down to us. They have come down through the chain of transmission, from the boatmen of 1830 to the boatmen of 1860, to the elderly survivors of 1910, to the folk collectors of 1935, to the recordings of 1950, to the singers of today, who learned them from those recordings or from songbooks or from each other. The chain is unbroken, in some attenuated form, between the men who sang on the towpath in 1843 and the people who sing today. We are connected to them by the music, in a way that we are not connected to them by almost anything else. The food they ate, the clothes they wore, the houses they lived in, are all preserved only as artifacts in museums or as descriptions in books. The music is alive, the songs are still being sung. I think this is one of the things that makes folk music, and the folk music of any working community, more important than people sometimes recognise. It is the way the past speaks to the present in its own voice, rather than being described to us by historians. When you hear someone sing the Erie Canal, in a version that has been passed down for nearly 2 centuries, you are hearing, at a great distance, the actual voices of the men who lived this life. The melody they whistled while they walked. The words they sang to fill the long hours. The chorus they joined in at the tavern in the evening. The music carries something that prose does not quite carry, no matter how carefully the prose is written. The music carries the feeling. Tom Mahoney finishes his last song of the night at the Black Horse. The customers have been singing along on the chorus the way they always do, and the room is warm with the sound of 40 voices singing together, badly but enthusiastically, the way working people have sung together at the end of their working days for as long as there have been working days. Tom puts down his fiddle. He has another drink, which Daniel pours for him without being asked. The customers begin to drift out into the night, toward whatever beds they are sleeping in tonight, with the song still in their heads, the way songs stay in your head after a good evening of music. The room empties. The lamps are turned down. The day, finally, is over. The songs go with them, into the night, into the next day's work, into the rest of their lives. The songs go with us also, who have sat with this town for these hours. We have caught some of the music. We will carry some of it forward. The chain continues. The songs continue to be sung. Before we turn fully to the reflection, I want to give a moment to the animals of the canal, because they were everywhere in this world, and they have been mostly absent from our story so far, and I think their presence is part of what we are owed before we let this town go. The mules first, because the mules were the engines of the canal in the most literal sense. The Erie Canal at its peak had perhaps 15,000 mules working on it at any given time, mules pulling boats, mules waiting at docks, mules being switched out and rested, mules being fed and watered and shod and brushed and worked, day after day, season after season, for the entire life of the canal. The mule was the fundamental power source. Steam engines could not be used on canal boats because the wash from a paddle wheel would have torn up the canal banks. Horses could be used, and were, but mules were generally preferred because mules were sturdier than horses, more sure-footed, less prone to spook at unexpected sounds, and capable of pulling for longer hours without exhausting. The mule, in short, was the right animal for the job, and the canal era was the great age of the working mule in American economic life. A canal mule, treated well, could work for 15 to 20 years. The mules were owned, in most cases, by the boats themselves, which is to say by the captains, and the captains who treated their mules well found that their mules lasted longer and were more productive than the mules of captains who did not. There was a small minority of canal captains who were notoriously hard on their animals, and these captains had reputations that travelled the canal, and the lock tenders and the other captains looked askance at them, and the mule drivers who worked for them often did not stay long. The general standard, however, was decent care. The mules were valuable property. They were treated mostly in the way that valuable property tends to be treated, which is to say with a combination of practical attention and a certain casual affection that working with animals tends to produce. The mule drivers, like Frank Connors, came to know their animals individually. Each mule had a name, each mule had a personality. Rose, in the Murphy family's team, was the lead mule and was somewhat bossy with the other three. Ginny, Rose's partner in the working pair, was steady and patient and tended to defer to Rose. Pete and Hank, the second pair, were younger and were still learning the routine and were more likely to make small mistakes, like trying to wander off the towpath when something interested them on the heel path side. The drivers learned to manage these personalities. The mules, in turn, learned the drivers. The relationship was a working relationship, but it was real. Patrick, at 14, has known the family's mules since he was a small child. He grew up with them. He has fed them, brushed them, talked to them, gotten kicked by them on a few occasions. They are part of the household in a sense, even though they live in a barn at whatever stable the boat is tied up near. The horses also worked the canal, although less often than the mules. Some of the larger packet boats used horses for the speed they offered, which was greater than mules could provide. The packet boats that prioritised passenger comfort and quick travel sometimes used 4-horse teams instead of mule teams, and could make 4 miles an hour or even slightly more on good stretches. The horses were, however, more expensive to maintain and more prone to injury, and the freight boats, which were the great majority of canal traffic, stuck almost entirely with mules. The horse-drawn packet was the luxury option. The mule-drawn freighter was the working option. The dogs of the canal towns deserve a mention. Almost every canal town household had a dog. Almost every boat had a dog, in most cases a small one that lived in the cabin. The dogs served various functions. Watchdogs at the houses, alerting the families when strangers approached. Companion dogs on the boats, providing company on the long hours of travel. Working dogs at the warehouses, kept primarily to control the rats that any grain warehouse inevitably attracted. The dogs of the canal era were not pets in the modern sense mostly, although they were treated with affection. They had jobs, they earned their keep. They were in many ways integrated into the working life of the canal, in the same way the mules were, and they died and were replaced and the new dogs took up where the old dogs had left off. The cats of the canal town served similar rat control functions, both at the warehouses and on the boats. A canal boat without a cat was vulnerable to mice, and rats getting into the cargo. A canal boat with a good cat was protected. The cats lived on the boats, were fed by the families, slept where they pleased in the cabin, and went about their cat business with the independence that cats have always insisted upon. The Murphy boat has a cat named Whiskers, who is 12 years old, and who has been on the boat for 10 of those years, and who is, in his own way, a member of the family. He sleeps on Kate's bunk most nights. He hunts effectively when there are mice to hunt, and dozes peacefully when there are not. The children love him. The parents tolerate him with the affection that families tend to develop for the small creatures who have been with them through the years. The chickens at the lock tender's house, that I mentioned earlier in the story, are a small flock of about a dozen birds that provide eggs and occasionally a Sunday dinner. The cow, also at the lock tender's house, provides milk for the family. The pigs that some families kept, although Samuel and Hannah do not, provide pork in the autumn when they are slaughtered. The horses at the livery stable, the oxen at the few farms still working with oxen, rather than the increasingly common horse teams, the geese in the yards of certain houses, the goats of the German immigrants who keep them when their neighbours do not understand why. All of these animals are part of the daily life of the town. They are everywhere. They make sounds throughout the day, the rooster at dawn, the cow lowing for milking, the chickens fussing in their yard, the dogs barking when something startles them, the cat occasionally yowling about something only the cat understands. The town is, in this sense, much louder with animal sound than a modern town is, because we have, in our time, mostly removed the animals from the places where people live. I want to ask you something. When did you last hear, in your daily life, the actual sound of an animal that was not a pet? A working animal, a farm animal, the sound of a cow being milked or a chicken laying an egg or a horse being saddled. Most of us, if we are being honest, do not encounter these sounds in our normal lives. They have been removed from our cities and our suburbs in the name of efficiency and sanitation, both of which are real values, and I am not arguing against them. But the removal has changed the texture of the world in ways we sometimes do not notice. The town we have spent the night in is full of animal sounds. The boats we have been on are full of animal sounds. The towpath is the place where the mules walk and the air smells of mule sweat and mule manure and the particular smell of working animals doing working work. Our world has very little of this. Our world is, in its sounds and smells, much more sterile than the canal town world was. We have gained things by this. We have also lost things. The losses are subtle. They're easy to miss until you spend a long time imagining a world full of animal sound and animal smell, and then your own quieter world feels, briefly, slightly emptier. The animals are part of the canal town. They are part of every part of it. They are in the boats and on the towpaths and in the yards and in the fields and at the warehouses and at the lock tender's house and in the Black Horse where Daniel keeps a small terrier that follows him around all day. They are not always named in the historical records. They are part of the substance of life that is rarely listed in the official documents. But they are there, and the town would not have functioned without them, and the people who lived in the town knew this and treated the animals with the practical respect that the working relationship required. The mules go to their stables now in the evening. The dogs are called inside or settle themselves in their preferred spots in the yards. The chickens have gone to roost. The cow has been milked and is lying down in her stall. The cat on the boat is curled up at the foot of Kate's bunk. The animals are settling, the way the people are settling, into the quiet evening that the day has earned them. They are, in their way, part of the town. They have been part of it all night, even when we were not paying attention. They are owed also a moment of recognition before we let the story go. I want to take you for this section out of August and into late November, because I have been promising you all night that we would come back to winter, and because the winter on the canal is its own particular thing, and one of the most underappreciated parts of canal life. The canal closes for the year sometime between the middle of November and the middle of December, depending on the weather. The Canal Commission monitors conditions and issues the closing date when the ice begins to form in earnest in the upper levels. Once the ice is thick enough that boats are at risk of being trapped in it, or of having their hulls damaged, the canal is officially closed. The boats are pulled up onto the banks, the locks are emptied. The water in the canal is allowed to settle to a winter level. The whole long ribbon of the canal becomes, for the next 4 to 5 months, a frozen line through the New York countryside, walked occasionally by trappers and sometimes by daring young men taking shortcuts to neighbouring towns, but otherwise still. The closing of the canal is, in this town as in all canal towns, a date that everyone marks. It is, in a sense, the new year, the end of the working season, the beginning of the long quiet months. The day the canal closes, there is a particular feeling in the town, a mixture of relief and apprehension. Relief that the 8-month effort of the navigation season is finally over. Apprehension that the long winter is now beginning, and that the income that has been steady all summer will now have to be stretched until the canal opens again in April. The boatmen who have been the town's customers for the past months are gone mostly. The captains have taken their boats up onto the banks for repairs. The mule drivers have gone home to whatever home they have with their season's wages. The packet boats have been laid up for the winter. The traffic that filled the wharves all summer has emptied out almost overnight. And the town settles into its winter form. The taverns are still open, but they serve mostly local customers now, and the trade is much slower. The Black Horse in winter has perhaps 15 or 20 customers in an evening, where in summer it had 50 or 60. The fiddler still plays on Saturday nights, but is paid less and tips lower. The proprietor and his wife use the slower months to do the deep cleaning and repairs that the establishment needs, but that cannot be done while the place is busy. The tavern in winter smells different. The summer smells of sweat and tobacco and outdoor work give way to the winter smells of wood smoke and wet wool and the particular indoor smells of a place where men gather to escape the cold. The warehouses similarly are quieter. The wheat that was being moved through them all summer has either been shipped onto Albany or has been stored in barns and granaries to wait for the next season. Mr. Halloran, the warehouse keeper, uses the winter months to inventory his remaining stock, to repair the loading dock, to do the 1,000 small tasks that have been deferred. He works fewer hours. He sleeps more. He spends time with his family in a way that the navigation season did not allow. His wife appreciates this. The arrangement is one that canal town families have evolved over the decades. The summer is for work. The winter is for everything else. The lock tender's job changes in winter as well. The lock is closed, the gates are sealed, the chamber is drained to its winter level. Samuel has, technically, less to do. He still maintains the lock, which means he still inspects the gates regularly for damage, still makes the small repairs that keep the apparatus in working order, still walks the lock every day to make sure no vandalism or theft has occurred. But the day-to-day operation of cycling boats through is suspended. He has, for the first time in 8 months, his evenings entirely to himself. He has, for the first time, the leisure to read a book, or to take up a small project around the house, or simply to sit by the fire with Hannah and not worry about being called to the lock at any moment. This shift, from the relentless presence of the summer to the relative leisure of the winter, is one of the things that lock tenders and their families come to value most about the rhythm of the year. The winter is the reward for the summer. The winter is the time when the family becomes, again, fully a family. The winter is the time when the relationships that have been deferred or compressed during the busy season can be renewed. Samuel and Hannah, in the winter months, sit together in the front room every evening. They talk, they read, they play simple card games. They have the kind of unhurried conversation that the busy months do not allow. The relationship deepens every winter in a way that the summer has worn it down. The cycle is the cycle. The winter restores what the summer has taken. The town's children in winter attend school full-time since they are not needed for the warm weather work. The school year, as I mentioned earlier, runs from October through May, and the heart of it is the winter months. The schoolhouse, with its single wood stove in the centre of the room, is the warmest building in town for most of December, January and February. Miss Martin, the schoolmistress, opens the school at 7 in the morning to start the fire, and the children begin arriving at 7:30, and the school day runs until 3, and then the children go home through the snow to do their evening chores in the barn or the kitchen. The schoolhouse, in the winter, is the centre of the town's intellectual life. The children are reading. The children are doing their arithmetic. The children are learning the geography of a country whose maps still have considerable blank space on them, although the blank space is being filled in, year by year, as the Western Territories are surveyed. The winter is hard. I do not want to skip past this. The winter in upstate New York is genuinely hard. The cold is real. The snow is real. The ice on the windows is real. The drafts that come through the cracks in the walls and the gaps around the doors are real. The houses of this town, however well built, are not insulated by any modern standard, and the heat from the wood stoves and fireplaces is what stands between the family and the cold, and the heat does not always reach the corners of the rooms. The bedrooms upstairs in winter are cold enough that the water in the wash basins freezes overnight. The children sleep under 3 or 4 quilts. The adults sleep under similar arrangements. The morning ritual involves getting out from under the quilts into a room that is perhaps 35 degrees, dressing as quickly as possible, and going down to the kitchen where the fire has been lit and the room is warm. The wood. I should mention the wood. The wood is one of the central facts of winter life in this period. A house like Samuel and Hannah's, with 2 rooms downstairs that need to be heated, and the kitchen stove that needs to be fed continuously, and the small stoves upstairs that are lit only when the cold is severe, requires somewhere between 15 and 20 cords of wood per winter. A cord of wood is a stack 4 feet by 4 feet by 8 feet. 20 cords is a stack 4 feet wide and 8 feet long that is 80 feet tall, if you stacked it that way, which no one does. In practice, 20 cords is several large piles of split firewood that fill the woodshed and overflow into a covered area behind the woodshed. Samuel and Henry, in the late summer and fall, spend many days cutting and splitting the wood that will get the family through the winter. The wood comes from a small woodlot on the edge of town that the family has access to. The cutting is done with a 2-man crosscut saw. The splitting is done with an axe and wedges. The labour is enormous. The labour is also necessary. Without the wood, there is no heat. Without heat, there is no winter survival. I want to ask you something. When you turn the thermostat up in your house, do you ever think about what it would be like if the heat had to be cut and carried and split and stacked and burned by hand every winter? It is, like the water question I asked you earlier, one of those things that has so completely changed in the time since this story that we hardly notice the change. Heat's constant. Heat is invisible. Heat is delivered through pipes or through electric wires by infrastructure we do not have to think about. The people in this canal town in 1843 are intimately aware of every fire they light. They know the wood. They have handled every piece of it. They know which logs burn hot and quick and which logs burn slow and steady. They know how to bank a fire so that it will still be alive in the morning. They know how to start a new fire when the old one has gone out, which they do not want to have to do because starting a fire from coal takes time, and matches were still expensive in this period and were not used wastefully. The smell of wood smoke is the smell of the winter town. It is in the air constantly. Every chimney is producing it. The town has a particular character, in winter, that is partly defined by this smell. The smell mixes with the cold air, and with the smell of horses and the smell of cooking, and the occasional smell of livestock from the barns at the edges of town. The winter smells of this town are not the same as the summer smells. The summer smells of canal water and mule sweat and warehouse grain. The winter smells are smaller, more enclosed, more domestic. The town in winter is, in a sense, more itself. The summer brought in all the boatmen and the travellers and the visitors. The winter sends them away. The town in winter is just the town, just the people who live here, just the relationships and the buildings and the rhythms of a small community in cold weather. Christmas is the high point of the winter. The Christmas of this period is not the elaborate commercial holiday that it would become in the late 19th century. There is no Christmas tree in most homes, although the practice was beginning to spread from German immigrants. There is no extensive gift-giving, although small gifts within families are customary. The Christmas of this period is primarily a religious observation, with the church service in the morning and a special meal in the afternoon. The meal in Samuel and Hannah's house will include a roast chicken if the family can spare one of the laying hens, or a piece of pork if the family has slaughtered the pig that fall, or, in lean years, simply an extra portion of the salt pork that is the foundation of so many meals. There will be a pie. There will be small gifts for the children, perhaps a piece of candy that has been bought in advance from the dry goods store and saved for the day, perhaps a small toy that Samuel has whittled in the evenings during the weeks before. There will be a sense of pause, of the day being marked off from the other days, of the family being together in a particular way that justifies the preparations. Hannah has been preparing for Christmas since November. She has been making, in small batches in the evenings, small wooden ornaments to hang in the front window. She has been baking, the day before Christmas, the special bread that she only makes for this occasion, a sweetened bread with raisins that her grandmother brought over from the old country, and that has been in the family for 4 generations. She's been sewing, in the weeks before, small items for the children, a new scarf for Edward, a new bonnet for Rebecca, a new shirt for Patrick. The children, on Christmas morning, will unwrap these items from the brown paper they have been packed in, and the children will be pleased, and the items will be put into use immediately because the children need them. The gifts of this period are practical. The gifts are also infused with the labour of the giver. Hannah did not buy the bonnet from a store. Hannah made the bonnet in the evenings while everyone else was reading or sleeping. The bonnet is, in a real sense, hours of Hannah's life condensed into a wearable object. The children, when they wear these gifts, are wearing their mother's time. I find myself thinking about this often when I think about the gift culture of this period. Gifts had a different quality. Gifts were not mostly mass-produced objects bought from stores at the last minute. Gifts were objects produced specifically for the recipient, often by the giver, often over weeks or months of evening work. The act of giving was accordingly weightier. The receiving was accordingly more direct an acknowledgement of the giver's investment. We have in our time made gift-giving easier and faster and more abundant. We have not necessarily made it more meaningful. The Christmas in this canal town in 1843 has fewer gifts than a modern Christmas, but the gifts that exist mean more in some ways than the gifts of a modern Christmas, because they carry the labour of the giver inside them. The New Year, when it comes, is observed quietly in this town. There is no extensive celebration. There are no fireworks, there are no parties. There is mostly the same evening routine as any other winter evening, with perhaps a small toast at midnight if the family is up that late, which they often are not. The New Year arrives, it is acknowledged. The next morning the routine resumes. The winter continues. The deepest part of winter in this region is January and February. The cold is at its most severe. The days are at their shortest. The light when it comes is thin and watery. The town during these months is at its most enclosed. The streets are often impassable for days at a time after a major snowstorm. The mail, which arrives weekly in the warmer months, arrives less reliably. The newspapers from Albany come a week late if they come at all. The town becomes, for stretches of days, almost completely isolated from the outside world. The people of the town turn inward, toward each other, toward their houses, toward the fires they keep going, toward the slow internal work of getting through the winter. This is when, I think, the community of the town is most fully expressed. The neighbours check on the older residents who live alone. The men shovel the paths between the most necessary buildings. The women share the food and the supplies that have run short in some households and that are abundant in others. The community functions in deep winter as a kind of survival mechanism. The 800 people of this town are, in the deep winter, fully aware of each other's existence and need in a way that the busy summer months did not require. The children of one family who are sick are visited by the women of 3 other families bringing soup. The widow who lives at the edge of town and who has trouble with her woodpile has the wood split for her by a neighbour's son. The single boatman who is wintering over in town, having been hired on by Mr. Halloran for general warehouse work in the off-season, eats Sunday dinners by rotation at the homes of various families who have informally adopted him. The town holds itself up. And then, slowly, the days begin to lengthen. The light returns. The cold begins to break, sometimes in late February, sometimes in early March, sometimes not until late March in a hard year. The ice on the canal, which has been thick and solid all winter, begins to crack and shift. The first signs of spring appear. The buds on the trees swell. The crocuses in some of the gardens push up through the snow. The mail begins to come more reliably. The newspapers report the news of the cities, where life has been continuing all winter, at a pace and a scale that the canal town has not been part of. The Canal Commission begins to inspect the canal in early March, looking for damage that needs to be repaired before the navigation season can begin. The maintenance crews arrive, doing the heavy work on the locks and the bank repairs that a winter of freezing and thawing has made necessary. The boatmen begin to return to the town in advance of the opening of the canal to put their boats back in the water and to prepare for the new season. The town wakes up slowly, the way a sleeper wakes up in a warm bed, in stages, with the day already well underway by the time the eyes are fully open. By April, the canal is open again. The first boats come through. The lock tender resumes his summer schedule. The tavern fills up with boatmen. The warehouses begin to receive shipments. The cycle resumes. Another navigation season begins, the way another navigation season has begun every year for the past 18 years, and the way it will continue to begin every year for another 2 or 3 decades before the railroads finally take over and the canal era comes to its end. The winter has done its work. The summer is beginning. The town is alive again. The pattern that has held this place together for 2 decades holds it together for another year. The lock tender opens the gates. The boat moves through. The water flows. The mules walk. The boy walks. The wheat moves east. The country moves forward. And the small town along the canal, holding its small piece of the larger thing together, watches the boats pass through and thinks about supper and goes about the business of its days. I want to spend the longest stretch of tonight's story on this one section, because I think it is the section that matters most, and because everything we have been doing all evening has been pointing toward it. The question I keep coming back to when I think about the canal era is this: what did these people understand that we have half forgotten? They were not by any objective measure more virtuous than we are. They were not wiser exactly, although I think they were wise about certain things. They were not happier in any way that we can measure across the gap of 2 centuries. They were just people, doing their lives with the resources they had. But I have come to believe, after spending a long time with them, that they understood some things about being alive that we have made it harder for ourselves to understand, and that some of those things are worth recovering, or at least worth thinking about. The first thing they understood, I think, was the relationship between effort and consumption. We have already touched on this in the section about water, but I want to come back to it because it runs through every part of their lives. When you have to make almost everything you use, when you have to grow it or hunt it or buy it from someone who made it by hand, when you have to carry it home and cook it on a stove you fed with wood you cut yourself, you become aware of the cost of things in a way that is structurally different from how we become aware of the cost of things now. The price tag in our world is the cost. In their world, the price tag was only one part of the cost. The other part was the effort, the time, the attention, the labour that went into getting the thing in the first place. And because the effort was always present, the gratitude was always available. You drank a cup of coffee in a canal town in 1843, and you were aware that someone, possibly you yourself, had pumped the water and chopped the wood and roasted the beans and boiled the kettle and poured the cup. The cup of coffee was the end of a whole sequence of human acts. The cup of coffee was therefore valuable in a way that it cannot be valuable when you press a button on a machine and the coffee appears. We have made coffee much easier. We have perhaps inevitably made it less precious. I'm not arguing that we should make our coffee harder. That would be silly. I am arguing that the awareness of effort, when it is woven through your daily life, produces a kind of attention to what you have that is genuinely difficult to produce when effort has been mostly removed. The people in this canal town were paying attention to their cups of coffee in a way that I sometimes try to remember to pay attention to mine. The remembering is not always successful. The cup of coffee in front of me right now while I write this sits in a mug I bought from a store, made from beans I bought from another store, brewed in a machine I plugged into a wall. The whole sequence of human labour that produced the cup is hidden from me. I have to work to make it visible again. The work is worth doing when I remember to do it. The cup tastes better when the work has been done. The second thing they understood, I think, was the value of skill. Not skill in the abstract sense that we sometimes talk about, the resume sense, the credential sense, but skill in the practical sense of being able to do specific useful things with your hands and your body and your knowledge. Samuel knows how to operate a lock. Hannah knows how to keep a household. John the blacksmith knows how to forge iron. Mr. Bachman knows how to make barrels. Mary at the tavern knows how to feed 40 men dinner from a small kitchen. Miss Martin knows how to teach 25 children of different ages in one room. Frank Connors knows how to walk 30 miles a day with mules. These skills were earned. They were earned through years of practice, often through formal apprenticeship, often through the slower, informal teaching of working alongside someone older who knew the work. The skills, once earned, were carried in the body and the mind in a way that made the worker a substantial person. You knew what you knew. You could do what you could do. Your value to the community was visible and traceable. The community valued you for the skill you had developed, in the most practical sense. We still have skills, we still develop them, but we have moved much of our work into domains where the skill is less visible, less tactile, less easily traced. We work on screens, we move information, we coordinate. These are real skills, and they have real value, and I do not want to dismiss them. But I notice when I spend time in workshops with people who still do physical skilled work that there is a particular satisfaction in watching them work that we have lost some access to in white-collar life. The blacksmith making a horseshoe, the carpenter framing a wall, the cook preparing a meal. There is a visible competence at work, a visible result, a visible outcome of the day's effort. Many people in our period of history report a vague sense that their work does not produce anything they can see or touch or point to. The Canal era did not have that problem. The work was visible, the output was concrete, the barrels were made, the wheat was loaded, the boats were locked through. At the end of the day, you could look at the things you had done and know that you had done them. The third thing they understood, I think, was the deep importance of small communities. The town we have spent the night in is a small community. 800 people. Almost everyone knows almost everyone. The relationships are dense. The accountability is direct. If you cheat someone in business, the whole town will know within a week. If you fall on hard times, the whole town will know within a day, and several of your neighbours will arrive at your door with food and offers of help. The community functions as a kind of distributed support system, an insurance policy that does not have to be paid for in advance, because the premiums are paid in the form of relationships maintained over years. Mrs. Sutton, when her husband died, did not face the future alone. The town stepped in. Her oldest son built her the additional rooms. Her daughters helped her with the washing. The boatmen who had known her husband stopped by for years afterward to make sure she was managing. The community held her up. We have, in our time, mostly traded this kind of community for other forms of support. We have insurance companies, we have government programs, we have therapists and consultants and the various professional services that the community used to provide informally. These replacements are not without value. The insurance company will pay your hospital bill in a way that no community potluck can. But there is a quality of relationship that the older system had that the newer system lacks. The relationship of being known, of being someone in the community whose presence is registered, whose absence is noticed, whose troubles are part of the shared concern of the people around you. We have tried to compensate for the loss of this with social media and with chosen communities of various kinds, and some of the compensation has been partially successful. But but the dense, small-scale community of the canal town is, in many respects, a thing that has largely disappeared from American life, and I think the disappearance has cost us something. I want to ask you something. Do you have a community? I do not mean Twitter followers or LinkedIn connections or the email list of an organization you donate to. I mean a group of people, identifiable individuals, whose names you know, and whose troubles you would step up for and who would step up for yours. Some of you do. Some of you do not. There is no shame in either answer. The structures of modern life make this kind of community much harder to build and much harder to maintain than it was in a town like the one we have visited tonight. But it is, I think, one of the things worth building when you can build it. The 800 people of this canal town in 1843 were, in a real sense, holding each other up. The holding was not always graceful. There were feuds and grudges and people who did not speak to each other for years. But the structure of holding was there, even when individual relationships within it failed. We have, in our time, made the holding harder to build. We have to be more deliberate about it. Some of us are, some of us are not. The deliberateness, when it happens, often produces the same kinds of relationships that the canal town produced naturally. The fourth thing they understood was the slowness of meaningful change. The canal itself took 8 years to build, from 1817 to 1825. It was the largest civil engineering project ever undertaken in North America at that point. It was built almost entirely by hand, by Irish immigrants and farm labourers and freedmen, and the various other workers that the contractors could hire. It was 363 miles long. It crossed valleys and ridges and rivers. It required 83 locks. It required 18 aqueducts that carried the canal over rivers and streams. It required innumerable bridges and culverts and feeder channels. It was, in short, an enormous undertaking, and it took 8 years of continuous labour by thousands of workers to complete. When it opened in 1825, the celebration was real. The Wedding of the Waters, they called it, when the first boat travelled the full length of the canal from Lake Erie to the Hudson, and a barrel of Lake Erie water was poured ceremonially into the harbour of New York. The country had connected itself to itself, in a way it had not been connected before. The connection had taken 8 years of work to make. This is, I want to suggest, a different relationship to time than the one we typically have. We expect in our time that things should happen quickly. We expect software updates daily. We expect news reports hourly. We expect our deliveries the next day. We have in many ways accelerated our lives to the point where we struggle to engage with anything that takes more than a few weeks to develop. The canal took 8 years. The town that grew up around the canal took another decade after that to become the established place we visited tonight. The skills that the people in the town possessed took 20 years of practice to develop. The relationships in the town were built over generations. Time, in this world, was a different medium. It moved more slowly. It allowed slower developing things to develop. The slow development was not a bug. It was a feature. Some things are worth waiting for, and some things only come into being if you can wait for them. I do not think we can fully recover this relationship to time. Our world has moved on in ways that make it impossible. But I noticed that the things in my own life that I most value have all taken time to build. The friendships of decades, the skills of years, the understanding of subjects that I've been thinking about for as long as I've been able to think, the slow accumulation of small experiences that, when assembled, make a life. None of this can be hurried. Even now, the thing that takes 30 years to build still takes 30 years to build, regardless of whether your phone has notifications or not. The acceleration of the rest of life sometimes obscures this fact, but the fact remains. Slow things take long. The people in this canal town knew this in their bones. We know it sometimes when we are paying attention. The fifth thing they understood, I think, and this is the one I find most difficult to articulate but most important to try to articulate, was the inevitability of difficulty. They lived inside difficulty. Their lives were structurally hard, the work was physical, the weather was harsh, the medical care was inadequate, the food was sometimes scarce, the deaths came earlier than they do now, and from causes that we have largely eliminated. They knew, in a way that we have made ourselves forget, that life is hard. And because they knew it, they did not waste energy on resenting it. They did not mostly expect their lives to be easy. They expected their lives to be hard, and they got on with the work of living inside the difficulty as competently as they could manage. This is, I think, one of the most underappreciated mental dispositions of pre-industrial and early industrial life. The acceptance, not the passive resignation of someone who has given up, but the active acceptance of someone who has decided that the only way to do anything is to do it inside the difficulty, rather than to fight against the existence of difficulty itself. Hannah does not resent the fact that she has to pump water by hand. She just pumps the water. Samuel does not resent the fact that the lock gates leak and need to be repaired. He just repairs them. Frank Connors does not resent the fact that he has to walk 30 miles a day. He just walks. The work is what the work is. The life is what the life is. The acceptance is the precondition for the doing. I notice in our time a particular kind of suffering that comes from non-acceptance. We expect our lives to be smooth, and we are surprised and aggrieved when they are not. We expect our jobs to be fulfilling, and we are anxious when they are merely jobs. We expect our relationships to be transformative, and we are disappointed when they are merely the long company of imperfect people. The Canal Town people would have found a great deal of this puzzling. They had jobs. The jobs were jobs. They had relationships. The relationships were the relationships. They had lives. The lives were lives. They did not expect more, and so they did not feel cheated when more did not arrive. And because they did not feel cheated, they were free to take the satisfaction that did arrive, in the small forms it took, with full attention and full appreciation. I want to be careful here, because I do not want to romanticize their hardship. Their hardship was real. People died. Children buried their parents young. Mothers buried their children. Hard work broke bodies before they had a chance to grow old. Diseases that we now treat with antibiotics killed people in days. The acceptance of difficulty was not the acceptance of preventable suffering. They would have welcomed, gladly, every modern improvement that has reduced human suffering. They would have wept with gratitude at the sight of a hospital with antibiotics. They would have. They are not. We are not going back to their world, and we should not want to. We have made enormous improvements. Those improvements are real and worth defending. But the disposition of acceptance, the willingness to live inside difficulty as a matter of fundamental orientation, rather than as a temporary inconvenience to be overcome and then forgotten, that disposition was something they had, that we have, in many ways, lost. And the loss of it has produced its own forms of suffering. The suffering of the person who feels constantly that life is somehow failing them, that something has gone wrong, that the difficulty they are experiencing is unfair. The Canal Town people would have found this perspective bewildering. They knew the difficulty was the substance of life. They knew the difficulty was the soil in which whatever pleasures life produced were going to grow. They lived inside it. They did the work. The sixth thing they understood, and we are coming to the end now, was the long inheritance of human work. The canal they were working on had been built before they got there. The town they were living in had been built by previous generations. The skills they had been taught had been developed over centuries. The food they ate, the clothes they wore, the houses they lived in, the ideas in their heads, all of it came to them from the long line of human beings who had come before them. They were, in the most literal sense, the beneficiaries of an inheritance they had not earned. And they understood this. They worked, in their turn, to add their own small contribution to the inheritance, to leave the world slightly better than they had found it, in whatever small ways they could manage. Samuel maintained the lock. The lock he maintained had been built by other men. The lock he maintained would, if he did his work well, still be operating after he was dead. He was not the originator. He was a steward. I think this disposition, the steward disposition, is one of the most useful dispositions a person can have, and it is one that we have made it harder for ourselves to access. We tend to think of ourselves, in our culture, as the originators of our own lives. We make our own choices. We build our own paths. We are the protagonists of our own stories. All of this is, of course, true in some senses, but it obscures the deeper truth, which is that almost everything we have, almost everything we know, almost everything we are able to do came to us from somewhere else. From parents and teachers and authors and craftspeople and scientists and farmers, and the long anonymous chain of human beings whose accumulated work made our world possible. We are stewards before we are originators. We are inheritors before we are anything else. And when we live well, when we live in a way that makes some kind of sense, it is in part because we have done our small part to maintain and improve the inheritance before passing it along to whoever comes next. The canal era is over now. It ended in stages, beginning around 1855, when the railroads first reached parity with canal freight rates, and continuing through the rest of the 19th century, as the railroad network grew and the canal traffic gradually fell away. By 1900, the Erie Canal was carrying a fraction of the freight it had carried in its peak years. By 1918, when the barge canal replaced the original alignment in many places, the old canal was a historical curiosity in much of its length. By the mid-20th century, the towpaths were overgrown in many sections, the locks were ruins in others, and the small towns that had grown up around the canal were in many cases decaying. But the work that was done in those decades when the canal was running did not disappear. The wheat that moved through the canal fed the cities. The cities grew. The cities became the engines of a continental economy. The skills that were developed on the canal moved with the people who developed them, into the railroads and the factories and the new industries of the late 19th century. The capital that was earned in the canal trade was reinvested in other ventures, some of which became important. The towns that grew around the canal contributed their children to the larger national life, and the children carried with them the values and the habits of the places they had been raised. The canal era was not just a 40-year economic phenomenon, it was a 40-year transmission belt. It moved goods, but it also moved people and ideas and skills, and the small accumulating contributions to the long human inheritance. The lock tender of our story, Samuel, died in 1868, at the age of 54 of pneumonia. He was buried in the small graveyard behind the Methodist church on the hill. Hannah lived until 1883. She moved, after Samuel's death, to live with their daughter Rebecca, who had completed her normal school training and who taught school in a town 50 miles east, and who had married a man Rebecca chose, and who had her own small family, and who took her widowed mother in for the last 15 years of her life. Hannah died at the age of 76 in Rebecca's house, on a quiet morning in early spring, of nothing in particular. The Murphy family, the boat family, dispersed in time. Patrick became a captain on the canal in his own right, ran his own boat for 15 years, and then bought a farm near Rochester when the canal trade began to decline, and lived there with his wife and children for the rest of his life. Bridget did go to Connecticut. She did attend the school her aunt had recommended. She became a writer of some local note in New England, publishing essays and stories in the periodicals of the day, and she lived a long life in Hartford with a woman named Elizabeth who had been her closest friend since school, and the two of them ran a household together for 40 years and were widely admired in their community for the cultivation of their home and the breadth of their reading. Thomas, the boat naturalist, became a hunter and trapper in the Adirondacks and lived a life largely outside the cash economy, and never married, and died in the woods alone in his 60s, having lived exactly the life he'd wanted to live since he was 8. Kate, the youngest, married a doctor and lived in Buffalo, and had 6 children, and died in 1898, having outlived all of her siblings. These were ordinary lives. They were also, in their ordinariness, extraordinary, because every life has, when you look at it carefully, a depth and a particularity that is not captured by the words ordinary or extraordinary. The lives were just lives. They happened. They had their own internal weight. The people who lived them did the best they could with what they had, in the time they were given. They built what they built. They left what they left. They are gone now. They have been gone for more than a century in most cases, but they were here, in this town and in towns like it, and they did the work, and the work matters. I've spent a long time, in the course of putting this story together, with the voices of people like the ones in this town. I have read their letters when their letters survive, which is rarely. I've read their diaries when their diaries survive, which is even rarer. I have read the court records and the census records and the tax records, which mention them by name even when nothing else does. I have read the local histories that were written by retired schoolmasters in the 1890s, when the canal era was still living memory, and the elderly residents could still be interviewed. I have spent time, as much time as one can across the gap between the living and the dead, with what they had to say about their own lives. What I keep coming back to, after all of that, is the smallness of what they ask for. The people I have spent time with did not on the whole ask for grand recognition. They did not ask to be celebrated. They asked quietly, in the testimony of how they lived, that the work be remembered. That the canals they built and the boats they ran and the locks they tended and the homes they made and the children they raised and the skills they developed be remembered as the substance of American life in the decades when it was the substance, before it was overtaken by other things and other forms. This is what they ask for. This is, in some small way, what tonight has been. The remembering, the careful holding of the small things, the acknowledgement that the work was real and the people who did it were real, and the lives they lived were full of more than the highlights that have made it into the textbooks. The small canal town we have visited tonight, on this Tuesday in 1843, will not appear in any textbook. The names of its residents, if anyone remembers them in 50 years, will be remembered by their grandchildren, and possibly by their great-grandchildren, and after that probably not. They are, by the standards of historical fame, entirely ordinary. They are also, by the standards I have come to value most, extraordinary. They are doing the work. They are doing it well. They are doing it without recognition. They will, when they are old, look back on these years with a complicated feeling that will include somewhere in it a quiet pride in the fact that they were there, that they did their part, that the families came through, that the town came through, that whatever came next was at least partly the result of people like them doing what they did. I wanted to spend tonight with them. I wanted to spend it with you also. I wanted us to sit together for a few hours in this town in this year, in the cabins of the boats and the rooms of the houses and the kitchens of the taverns and the small workshops of the trades. I wanted us to feel what it was like to be inside this life. I wanted us to take seriously the possibility that the small daily work these people did was, in fact, the kind of work that holds civilizations together, and that the people who did it are owed a kind of remembering that goes beyond the big public stories of the period. I think we have done that tonight. I think, in the careful, slow accumulation of detail, in the lock and the boat and the towpath and the tavern and the kitchen and the schoolroom, we have spent some real time with these people, and we have, I hope, taken them seriously in a way that history sometimes does not. Thank you so much for watching. If you'd like to see more videos like this, please consider leaving a like and subscribing to the channel. It really helps us keep making more content. See you in the next one. The lock now, the same lock, the same stone walls, but the angle of the light is different. It is morning again, not the early morning of 24 hours ago before the town had woken, a different morning. The light has come around to a slightly different place on the eastern wall of the lock chamber, where the first sun catches the top course of stones and turns them pale gold for a few minutes before moving on. The water in the chamber is at the upper level, full and still. Last night's final boat came through around 11, and Joseph closed the gates after it, and the chamber has been quiet ever since. Samuel is standing on the lock platform, his coffee in his hand, the cup white in the early light. He has come from the house where Hannah is starting breakfast, where the smell of bread and coffee filled the kitchen as he passed through, where Edward was already awake and sitting at the table reading the book he had refused to put down last night. Samuel stood for a moment in the doorway and watched his son reading. Then he came out to the lock. The stillness now is the stillness of a working place at the moment before work begins. In another 15 minutes, the first whistle will come from down the canal, and Samuel will move to the gate handle, and the day will begin. But for these 15 minutes, the lock is just a lock. The water is just water. The stone is just stone, and Samuel stands with his coffee and watches the light move down the eastern wall. He drinks. The coffee is hot. It tastes better than any other cup will today, because it is the first one and because the morning is still his, and because he has, in front of him, a few minutes before the first boat comes. He looks down the canal. The mist is rising. There is one small light on at the warehouse, where Mr. Halloran is already at work, also up early, also alone, also drinking his morning coffee in his own place in his own life. Samuel and Mr. Halloran cannot quite see each other through the mist, but each knows, without having to verify, that the other is there. Tomorrow morning, when they wave across the canal from their respective doorways, the wave will carry beneath it the knowledge that they were both up at this hour today, and yesterday, and most days, and that they were each holding their own small piece of the town in motion. The clock in the lockhouse strikes the half-hour faintly through the open kitchen window, 5:30. Samuel is not thinking in any organised way about anything in particular. He is simply present at the lock, in the morning, in his own life. His hand is wrapped around the warm cup. The cup is white. It has a small chip on the rim that his thumb finds without his looking. He has used